Hey guys, tonight we're going to step back in time, not to a grand castle or a thundering battlefield, but to the murky, firelit corners where ordinary medieval people tried to have a little fun. You're about to be a guest at their feasts, a player in their brutal games, and a spectator to their strange and sometimes terrifying pastimes. You see the glint of firelight on a crude wooden cup, you hear the roar of a crowd, but it's not for a rock concert, it's for something far more visceral. And let's be honest, if you were dropped into this world with your modern sensibilities and your preference for clean water, you probably wouldn't survive the first week, let alone find time for fun. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where in the world and what time of day you're tuning in from, so drop your city and local time in the comments below. It's always amazing to see our little community stretching across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The journey begins, as so many did, by pushing open a heavy splintered oak door. It groans on its leather hinges, a sound like a waking beast, and for a moment you're a silhouette against the fading grey twilight. Then you step inside, and the world changes. The air is thick, a heavy blanket woven from 3 distinct threads, wood smoke from a central fire pit, the sweet malty tang of spilled ale, and the close, unwashed scent of humanity. It's not just an odour, it has weight. It coats your tongue and prickles at the back of your throat. Your eyes adjust slowly to the gloom. The only light comes from the crackling fire, and a few sputtering tallow candles set in iron holders on the wall. They drip and smoke, casting long dancing shadows that make the room feel alive and full of secrets. The light is greasy, yellow, and smells faintly of burnt fat. The mood lighting here is less romantic dinner for two and more you might get shanked for the buckles on your shoes. You pick your way across the floor, and your boots make a soft, rustling, slightly squelching sound. The floor is packed earth, covered in a thick layer of rushes. In theory, this is medieval carpeting, meant to soak up spills and be swept out periodically. In practice, it's a living museum of the tavern's recent history. Mixed in with the dried reeds are discarded chicken bones, a slick of grease, something that might be a lump of cheese, and generations of spilled drinks. It's basically a compost pile that doubles as a carpet, and you try very hard not to think about what tiny creatures might call it home. You find an empty spot on a long, rough-hewn bench next to a wall. The wood is dark and polished smooth by centuries of wool and leather trousers. Around you, the tavern hums with a low, guttural energy. There are no shouts, no raucous laughter, just the steady murmur of conversation. 2 farmers with faces as weathered as old leather are hunched over their cups, arguing quietly about the price of barley. A man in slightly finer, though still mud-splattered, clothes, perhaps a merchant's clerk, sips his drink alone, his eyes darting around the room. A woman with strong arms and no-nonsense expression on her face approaches you. This is the alewife, the heart of this establishment. In many villages, brewing was women's work. When a new batch of ale was ready, she would have placed an ale stake, a long pole, often with a leafy bush tied to the end, out by the road to advertise. This simple sign was a cornerstone of the local economy, a signal that a temporary public house, or alehouse, was open for business right here in her home. She slops a cup down in front of you without a word. It's not glass or even pewter, but a simple mug made of dark wood, bound with strips of leather. You lift it to your lips. The liquid inside is cloudy, lukewarm, and tastes heavily of yeast and grain, with a slightly sour finish. This isn't the crisp, hoppy lager you know, it's small beer, a weak, watery brew that was a staple of the medieval diet. It was, crucially, safer to drink than water from the local well or stream, which could be teeming with life-threatening bacteria. People of all ages, including children, drank this daily, not for intoxication, but for hydration and calories. Frankly, it has about as much alcoholic kick as a sleeping kitten. As you sip, you realise this place isn't about escape in the way a modern bar is. It's about necessity. It's a warm, dry place to wait out the rain. It's a source of liquid calories after a long day of back-breaking labour in the fields. And it's a social hub, but one viewed with deep suspicion by the authorities. Historians still argue whether the tavern was primarily a simple community gathering spot, or a dangerous hotbed of sedition, crime, and godless behaviour. The church preached against the sins that unfolded in such places: gambling, gossip, and worse. The local lord worried that here, amongst the dregs of ale, his peasants might start getting revolutionary ideas. You look around the room again, at the firelight catching the tired lines on the faces of your fellow patrons. This is the starting line for medieval fun. Everything we're about to explore. The games, the songs, the festivals. It all starts or ends here, in a place like this, over a cup of weak ale. And just as that thought crosses your mind, you hear a new sound from a dark corner of the room. The distinct sharp rattle of bone dice being shaken in a leather cup, followed by a clatter as they're cast across a crude wooden table. The game is about to begin. You turn your head toward the sound, your eyes drawn to a small, wobbly table in the darkest corner. 3 men are leaning in close, their faces illuminated from below by a single, rolled into one. Minstrels and travelling storytellers were the primary conduits of information, spreading tales of heroism, political spin, and news from the next valley over. The patrons of the tavern, who are almost all illiterate, hang on his every word. They may have heard the Ballad of Sir John a dozen times, but it's like rewatching a favourite film. They murmur the well-known lines and cheer when the song reaches the part about the raiders being sent packing. No one here is shouting for a new song. They want the comfort of the familiar story told well. He finishes the heroic ballad to a smattering of applause and a few grunts of approval. The alewife brings him a cup, his payment for the performance. Then, with a sly wink at a group of younger men, he launches into a second song. This one is different. It's faster, bouncier, and the lyrics are about a foolish miller who gets tricked by his wife and the village priest. It's bawdy, silly, and full of local in-jokes. Historians still argue whether the primary role of the minstrel was to reinforce social norms with heroic tales, or to subvert them with satire and gossip. Tonight, this one seems determined to do both. As the laughter from the rude song subsides, the heavy oak door groans open again, but this time it's thrown wide with a confident bang. A new group enters, and the atmosphere in the tavern shifts instantly. These men are louder, better dressed in dyed wools of blue and green, and they carry themselves with an air of careless authority. They aren't nobility, perhaps they're wool merchants or the retinue of a minor official, but they are clearly a class above the farmers and labourers. They look like they've just closed a deal and now they're here to celebrate. They don't just find a table, they take over the centre of the room, shouting for the best ale, for wine and for food. The quiet, murky tavern is about to become a different beast entirely. A feast is beginning. The arrival of the merchants changes the tavern's gravitational pull. Everything and everyone now orbits their boisterous, centrally located table. The alewife, who had a look of weary patience for the farmers, is now all bustling efficiency. She shouts for her son, a boy of about 10, who scurries out from a back room to help. Wine is produced, a clear status symbol. While the rest of you sip your cloudy, watery ale, a jug of deep red liquid is brought for the newcomers. It's probably not great wine by your standards, likely young, acidic, and transported in a cask that gave it some interesting notes of tar and wood. But it's wine, and its presence alone declares wealth and importance. Then comes the food. It arrives not on individual plates, but on large wooden platters, carried precariously by the alewife and her son. The centrepiece is a great meat pie, its crust a magnificent golden brown. Steam escapes from a slit in the top, carrying the rich scent of greedy-looking candle. The flame dances in their focused eyes. This is where the real action is. They aren't playing for fun, they are playing with a quiet, desperate intensity. The game is Hazard, a complicated dice game of Norman origin that would eventually evolve into the modern game of craps. It's a game of rules so convoluted you suspect the players themselves are only half sure of them, which of course only adds to the potential for arguments. The dice themselves are crude things, likely carved from the knuckle bones of a sheep or cow. The pips, the little black dots indicating the numbers, are unevenly drilled and stained. They are not the perfect, sharp-edged cubes of a modern casino. They are organic, unbalanced, and deeply personal. One of the men, a wiry fellow with a patchy beard, shakes the dice in a worn leather cup. The rattling sound is sharp and dry, a nervous tremor in the tavern's low hum. He mutters a quick phrase, half prayer, half curse, and casts the bones across the rough-sawn planks of the table. They tumble and skitter to a stop. A low grunt from the burly farmer opposite him. He pushes a small grimy pile of silver pennies into the centre of the table. The stakes are laughably small to your modern eyes, perhaps enough to buy a few loaves of bread, but here now it's a significant sum. For these men, it's the difference between a full belly and a hungry night. This is what the church railed against, calling dice the devil's bones, and gambling a gateway to every other sin, from blasphemy to murder. They weren't entirely wrong. You see a tension in the wiry man's shoulders, a flicker in his eyes that suggests he's one bad roll away from accusing his opponent of cheating. And cheating was an art form. It was common knowledge that dice could be loaded by drilling a hole and filling it with a drop of lead, making one side more likely to land face down. These uneven, hand-carved dice would be incredibly easy to manipulate. You wonder if the farmer's consistent losses are due to bad luck, or if the wiry man is just a very, very good craftsman. You're watching a masterclass in low-stakes, high-tension drama. Suddenly the game is over. The farmer slaps the table with his open palm, a sound that makes you jump. He shoves his bench back, stands, and stomps out of the tavern without a word, leaving his lost coins behind. The wiry man, with no great show of triumph, quietly sweeps the little pile of silver into a small pouch. The third man, who said nothing the whole time, just drains his cup and melts back into the shadows. The show is over. Into the vacuum of that small private drama a new sound blossoms. It's the gentle, hopeful sound of a string being plucked and tuned. From a stool near the fire pit, a man you hadn't noticed before clears his throat. He is a minstrel, but he's a far cry from the brightly dressed troubadours of romantic fiction. His clothes are the colour of road dust, patched at the elbows and knees. He's thin, and his face is a map of hard miles. But his instrument, a simple, pear-shaped lute, is clean and obviously well cared for. It is his livelihood. He begins to sing. His voice isn't beautiful or sweet. It's a reedy, nasal tenor, but it's strong, and it tells a story. He sings of a local knight, Sir John of the Vale, and his probably exaggerated battle against a band of Scottish raiders. This is the Medieval News History Lesson and Radio all. Misrule for the rest of the night. It's a tradition dating back to the Roman festival of Saturnalia, where for a brief period a slave could become a master. A hush falls over the merchant's table. Each man inspects his slice of cake carefully before taking a bite. One chews, then shakes his head. Another. Then a younger member of the party, a clerkish man who had been quiet until now, breaks into a wide grin. He opens his mouth and points. There, on his tongue, is the bean. A cheer goes up. The man is slapped on the back. A mock crown, perhaps made of twisted rushes from the floor, is placed on his head. Instantly his demeanour changes. The quiet clerk is gone, replaced by a swaggering, laughing monarch. His first decree is a round of the best wine for everyone, on his boss's tab, of course. His second decree is that the portly merchant leader must sing a song, and his third is that the minstrel must play a tune fit for a king. You are witnessing a powerful and strange social ritual. For one night the world is turned upside down. The clerk is king, and the master is his subject. Historians still argue whether these moments of inversion, like crowning a bean king, acted as a genuine safety valve for social tensions, by allowing the lower orders to blow off steam, or if they simply reinforced the established order by showing how chaotic and silly life would be without it. Either way, for this one night the rules are rewritten. The tavern is no longer just a place for a quiet drink, it's a temporary kingdom of chaos, ruled by a man whose only claim to power was a lucky bite of cake. Your time in the smoky tavern, with its temporary king and his boisterous court, fades as you step out into the crisp, cool air of the following day. The sun is a pale disk in a white sky, and the world feels fresh after the close confines of the alehouse. You find yourself on the edge of a wide green field behind a small castle or a fortified manor house. In the distance you can see the imposing stone keep, but here on the grass, the atmosphere is less about defence and more about practice. A group of young men, some barely old enough to grow a proper beard, are gathered here. They are squires and pages, the interns of the medieval military world. Their job is to serve a knight, care for his armour and horses, and learn the brutal, complicated art of combat. Today's lesson is not a real battle, nor is it a glamorous tournament. It's practice, and their opponent is a strange, silent, and surprisingly tricky foe made of wood, cooked meat and gravy across the room. Alongside it are roasted onions glistening with fat and a dark coarse bread torn into hunks. This isn't just sustenance, it's a performance. You watch as the leader of the group, a man with a thick neck and a fine wool tunic, takes his personal dagger from his belt, the medieval equivalent of a Swiss army knife, and plunges it into the pie. He carves out a huge dripping section for himself, then gestures for the others to help themselves. There are no forks. That particular piece of cutlery wouldn't become common in England for another 300 or 400 years. You eat with your fingers, your own knife, and a spoon if the food is liquid. For a plate, you have a trencher. A thick square slice of stale, day-old bread is placed before each man. This is the ultimate disposable dish. It's designed to soak up the juices and gravy from the meal. At the end of the feast, if you were a wealthy noble, you might give your gravy-soaked trencher to the poor, who waited by the door for such charity. Here in this tavern, you just eat your plate. It's efficient, if a little hard on the jaw. The men eat with a focused, animalistic hunger, tearing at the bread, grabbing chunks of meat and talking with their mouths full. Grease shines on their chins and fingers. They wipe their hands on their tunics or on the edges of the communal tablecloth. It's a messy, intimate and profoundly communal way of eating. Everything is shared. The food, the wine cups, the conversation. As the first wave of hunger subsides, the real fun begins. The merchant leader, feeling expansive, calls for a surprise. The alewife disappears and returns a moment later with another dish, and this one makes you blink in disbelief. It's a pie, yes, but as she sets it down, the crust begins to move. A small beak pokes through, then another. Suddenly the top of the pie erupts, and a flurry of small live birds, finches or sparrows, flutters out, chirping in a panic. They fly up into the smoky rafters of the tavern, much to the roaring delight of the merchants. This is a subtlety ale, or subtlety, a form of edible joke popular at medieval feasts. It was designed to surprise and impress the guests. Other famous examples included a swan or peacock, roasted and then redressed in its own feathers to look alive, or a boar's head presented with an apple in its mouth. It's a strange mix of culinary skill and a frankly bizarre sense of humour. Imagine cutting into a birthday cake and having a dozen frogs leap out. That's the vibe. The night deepens, the wine flows faster, and the talk gets louder. Now comes the main event of the evening's entertainment. It's January, just after Christmas, and the world is still in the festive grip of the 12 days of Christmas. The alewife brings out one last special item, a simple round cake, like a large flat loaf of bread, spiced with saffron and cinnamon. She cuts it into wedges, one for each of the merchants, and in a gesture of magnanimity, sends a piece over to the minstrel and even to you. This is a 12th night cake. Baked inside one of these slices is a single dried bean or a pea. The man who finds the bean in his portion is crowned the king of the bean, or the lord of. You're watching them train on a quintain. At its simplest, a quintain is a post with a shield mounted on it. The goal for a rider was to charge at it with a lance and strike the shield square in the centre. But the one they are using today is a more advanced and far more amusing model. It consists of a sturdy upright post with a freely rotating crosspiece. On one end of the crosspiece is a shield, the target. On the other end is a heavy sandbag, a wooden club, or some other unwieldy weight. A young squire, his face a mask of intense concentration, gets ready. He's on a sturdy-looking horse, holding a long wooden lance that is blunted for safety. At the far end of the field, he turns his mount, kicks its flanks, and begins to gallop towards the quintain. The horse's hooves tear at the turf, thundering across the field. The goal is twofold. First, he must strike the shield squarely with the tip of his lance. Second, and this is the crucial part, he must do it with enough speed and skill to be clear of the device before the other end swings around. He charges. His aim is true, and the lance connects with the shield with a satisfying thwack. But he is a fraction too slow. As he rides past, the rotating arm, now spinning with considerable momentum from his own blow, swings its heavy sandbag around and catches him squarely in the back of the head. He tumbles from his horse with a clumsy yelp, landing in an undignified heap on the grass. The sandbag, its work done, swings back and forth lazily. His companions on the sideline erupt in laughter. There's no malice in it, just the easy ridicule of peers. This is learning by humiliation. The quintain is a great teacher of speed and agility. To fail is to be literally beaten by your own success. It's a physical manifestation of the phrase, hoist with one's own petard. The squire picks himself up, red-faced and brushing dirt from his tunic, and trudges off to retrieve his horse, a wiser and probably sorer young man. This type of training was essential. While we often think of knights as natural-born warriors, the skills of mounted combat were incredibly difficult to master. Handling a lance, controlling a powerful warhorse, with only your legs while wearing what would eventually become 50 pounds of metal. It was like being an astronaut and a rodeo cowboy at the same time. The quintain provided a way to practice the fundamentals without the risk and expense of facing a real opponent. You also see a variation of the game being played on foot. A group of younger boys, pages perhaps, are using a smaller handheld version. It's a small shield on a stick held by one boy, while another runs at him and strikes it. The holder's job is to twist the shield at the last second so the blow glances off, teaching the attacker to maintain a firm grip. Interestingly, this wasn't just for the nobility. In some parts of England, especially London, quintain practice was a popular sport for commoners as well, particularly on holidays. There, instead of a field, the quintain would often be set up on a post in a river. A young man would stand in the prow of a boat that was rowed quickly towards the post. He'd try to strike the shield with a staff. If he failed or was too slow, he would be knocked off balance by the swinging, sandbag and end up, to the delight of the watching crowd, with a cold, wet dunking in the river. It was a spectator sport that combined athletic skill with a healthy dose of slapstick comedy. Historians still argue whether these games were primarily military training or a form of social display. Was the young squire's goal really to improve his martial skill, or was it to show off his horsemanship and courage in front of his peers and the ladies of the manor who might be watching from the castle walls? The answer most likely is both. It's a performance of masculinity, a demonstration of competence in the skills that defined a man of the knightly class. Another squire takes his turn. This one is older, more confident. He charges at the quintain, his posture perfect. He strikes the shield dead centre with a loud crack of wood on wood. But this time, he's already spurred his horse to greater speed, and he's well clear before the swinging arm can even get close. He pulls his horse to a halt at the end of the field with a flourish, raising his blunted lance in a small gesture of triumph. There's no laughter this time, just a few nods of approval from his fellows. He has passed the test. He has beaten the spinning wooden man. For now, his training is paying off, and he is one step closer to proving he is worthy of the real thing, the chaos, the glamour, and the deadly dance of the tournament joust. The practice field with its clumsy squires and spinning sandbags dissolves. The world around you brightens, saturated with colour and sound. The scent of cut grass is replaced by a heady mix of horse, sweat, and the faint, sweet perfume worn by noble ladies. The murmur of a few boys has swelled into the roar of a crowd. You're no longer behind the scenes, you're at the main event. You have a prime spot in the viewing stands, a temporary wooden structure draped in vibrant banners, overlooking a long, wide field known as the lists. This is the tournament. But it's not just a sport, it's a festival, a trade show, and a massive social gathering all in one. Knights have travelled for days, even weeks, to be here, bringing their squires, horses, and immense egos. They come to win glory, to catch the eye of a wealthy patron or a beautiful heiress, and to win tangible prizes, armour, horses, and sometimes enormous sums of money in the form of ransoms from their defeated opponents. The pageantry is dazzling. The field is a riot of heraldry. Each knight's shield, surcoat, and the caparison of his horse are emblazoned with his unique coat of arms. Lions, eagles, geometric patterns in bold primary colours. It's a visual language that everyone here understands, a way to instantly identify the combatants. Trumpets blare, a sound that cuts through the excited chatter of the crowd. Heralds, the medieval masters of ceremony, announce the names and lineages of the knights about to compete, their voices booming across the field. You feel a thrill of anticipation, a collective holding of breath. Break his neck or worse, be trampled by his own mount. King Henry II of France famously died in 1559 when a sliver of his opponent's lance pierced his eye and penetrated his brain during a joust. Back in the lists, the two knights are preparing for their second pass. A squire runs out to hand his master a new lance. The knight who was struck so hard on the shield is shaking his head, trying to clear it. You can see a new sense of grim determination in his posture. This isn't just for points anymore, it's personal. On the sidelines, ladies in fine silks and velvets watch with rapt attention. A knight might dedicate his joust to a particular lady, wearing her favour, a scarf or a sleeve, tied to his helmet or arm. This was all part of the game of courtly love, a highly ritualised and often theatrical form of aristocratic romance. Historians still argue whether courtly love was a genuine emotional experience or a literary and social game, a way to sublimate the violent urges of the warrior class into a more refined performance. The trumpets sound again. The knights charge. This time, there is no glancing blow. One knight strikes the other directly in the centre of his chest. The impact is catastrophic. The target knight is lifted bodily from his saddle, as if by an invisible hand, and flies backward through the air, landing on the ground with a sickening crash of metal and bone. His horse, panicked, gallops away. The crowd leaps to its feet, roaring. Squires rush onto the field. The victorious knight raises his shattered lance in triumph. He has won the day's glory, but down on the field a man lies motionless. A stark reminder that even in their most refined and celebrated pastimes, the spectre of death was always a guest of honour. Leaving the manicured aristocratic violence of the tournament lists behind, you travel down the social ladder, away from the world of knights and ladies. You find yourself in a muddy, sprawling landscape of fields and thatched roof cottages. The air no longer smells of perfume, it smells of damp earth and livestock. A strange, chaotic noise is building in the distance, not the focused roar of a tournament crowd, but a ragged, sprawling cacophony of shouting and yelling that seems to be coming from every direction at once. You follow the sound and crest a small hill, and the scene that unfolds below you is one of pure, unadulterated anarchy. This is mob football, or as it was known in various regions, camp ball, or hurling. And you realise with a jolt that the playing field is not a field at all. The playing field is everything. It's the entire space between two neighbouring villages, a distance that could be several miles. Identity and rivalry. Beating the neighbouring village at mob football was a matter of intense civic pride. It was a way of settling old scores and asserting dominance without resorting to actual warfare. It reinforced the bonds between the men of a single village while violently expressing their opposition to outsiders. It was community building through shared brutality. A quirky tidbit from the period suggests that sometimes the ball wasn't even a ball. In some parts of England, there are folkloric accounts of games being played with the severed head of a captured enemy, particularly a Dane, though these stories are likely more legend than fact, a way of romanticising the game's violent origins. The scrum below you has now moved into a shallow, muddy river. The water churns as dozens of men splash and fight for the leather bladder. From this distance, it's impossible to tell who is winning, or even who has the ball. It's just a single writhing organism of human struggle. It's not about tactics or athletic grace. It's about brute force, stamina, and a willingness to endure a shocking amount of pain and discomfort for the honour of your village. As the sun begins to dip lower, painting the chaotic scene in shades of orange and red, you realise this isn't just a game. It's a purge, a ritual of communal violence that makes the carefully controlled danger of the nightly joust look like a civilised tea party. You turn away from the sprawling chaos of mob football, seeking something more contained, perhaps more formal. Your journey takes you to the bustling heart of a town, into a purpose-built arena. It's a circular or octagonal structure, crudely built of timber, resembling a small rustic globe theatre. The air is thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and something else. A coppery animal tang of fear and blood. The crowd here is a cross-section of urban society. Merchants, apprentices, soldiers and labourers, all packed onto steep wooden benches, their faces animated with a grim, excited anticipation. In the centre of the arena is a sand-covered pit. Chained to a thick wooden stake in the middle of the pit is a large brown bear. It's a magnificent, powerful creature, but its fur is matted and scarred, and it sways its head from side to side in a repetitive, stressed motion. This is the star of the show. You've arrived at a bear baiting. A man with a long pole, the bear ward, prods the animal to make it more active. The crowd boos and jeers, not at the man, but at the bear, as if goading an enemy champion. Then a gate on the far side of the pit is raised, and a pack of English mastiffs is released. These are not pets. They are powerful, aggressive hunting dogs, bred for their courage and their brutal bite. They charge into the pit, barking furiously, and launch themselves at the bear. The teams are not neatly organised squads of 11 players. The teams are the entire able-bodied male populations of those 2 villages. Hundreds of men, from young boys to grizzled old farmers, are swarming across the landscape in a single, heaving, muddy mass. Their goal is simple: get the ball to the opposing village's church door or a local mill, or some other designated landmark. How they do it is another matter entirely. The ball itself is a small, hard object, roughly the size of a modern softball. It's a pig's bladder, inflated and encased in a tough leather shell. It's durable, but not exactly bouncy. There are no rules about passing, no offside rule, no neatly marked sidelines. You can kick the ball, punch it, carry it, throw it. You can also kick, punch, carry, and throw your opponents. The only real rule seems to be a general prohibition against outright murder, though even that seems to be a guideline rather than a strict regulation. You watch as the central scrum, a writhing pile of dozens of men, fights over the ball. It's like a rugby scrum, a mosh pit, and a full-scale riot all rolled into one. Men are wrestling, shoving, and grappling in the mud. Fists fly. Someone emerges from the pile, clutching the precious ball, and makes a frantic dash for open ground. He doesn't get far. He's immediately swarmed and tackled, disappearing back into the human tide. The game flows like a river of chaos, surging through fields, splashing across streams, and crashing through hedgerows. Private property is not respected. The mob might trample through a farmer's carefully planted turnip patch or knock over a flimsy fence. This was a major reason why authorities despised the game. Numerous royal edicts were passed over the centuries trying to ban it. King Edward II declared it illegal in London in 1314 because the noise and chaos were disturbing the peace and leading to many evils. His successors, right up through the Tudor period, would repeat the ban, which suggests that nobody was paying much attention. These games were often played on specific holidays, most famously Shrove Tuesday, the day before the solemn fasting of Lent was set to begin. It was a day for one last massive explosion of excess and pent-up energy. The most famous of these games, which still survives in a heavily modified form today, is the Ashbourne Royal Shrovetide football match, where the upards and downards of the town still compete. You see a group break away from the main pack, chasing a lone player with the ball down a narrow village lane. An old woman hastily shutters her windows as the mob thunders past. This was not a spectator sport in the modern sense. You didn't sit and watch. You either participated or you got the hell out of the way. The danger was very real. Broken bones were common. Drownings happened when the scrum chased the ball into a river. Historians have found coroner's reports from the 14th century detailing deaths that occurred during these matches, often from accidental stabbings when players ran onto each other's knives, which many men carried as part of their daily attire. Historians still argue about the social function of this brutal game. Was it simply a chaotic pastime, a way for young men to let off steam, or was it a highly ritualised expression of local? The bear ward finally steps in and pulls the last of the snarling dogs away. The bear slumps to the ground, panting, its flanks heaving. The show is over for now. The crowd begins to disperse, loudly arguing about their bets, already anticipating the next match. You see the eagerness in their eyes, the thrill they get from this raw display of life and death struggle. It's a chilling reminder that the definition of fun can be a dark and terrifying thing, and as the stench of blood hangs heavy in the air, you're about to witness an even stranger, though perhaps slightly less bloody, use of animals for sport. You move away from the grim, blood-soaked sand of the bear pit, seeking respite from the raw brutality. Your journey takes you to a more refined setting, a place of manicured lawns and high society. You find yourself on the sprawling estate of a wealthy German or Saxon aristocrat in the late 17th or early 18th century, a bit past the high medieval period, but a direct bizarre descendant of its festive culture. The air is filled with the sound of laughter, music from a small ensemble, and the clinking of wine glasses. Men in powdered wigs and women in elaborate gowns stroll across the green, engaging in witty conversation. It feels a world away from the gritty violence of the bear-baiting arena. But then you see it. In the centre of a large open area of the lawn, 2 long strips of canvas or rope netting are laid out parallel to each other, about 20 feet long and a few feet apart. Teams of 2 people, a gentleman and a lady, are taking their places, each pair holding the ends of one of the canvas strips. They hold it loosely, creating a shallow trough between them. Another servant approaches, carrying a small wriggling cage. This is the setup for today's main entertainment, a sport known as Fuchsprellen, or fox tossing. The servant opens the cage and a live fox, its eyes wide with panic, is released into the grassy enclosure that has been fenced off for the event. The fox, confused and terrified, darts around looking for an escape. As it runs between one of the pairs of canvas slings, the gentleman and lady holding it suddenly pull their ends taut. The result is startling. The strip of canvas acts as a simple, powerful sling. The fox is launched high into the air, tumbling end over end, sometimes reaching heights of 20 or 25 feet. It lands with a soft thud on the grass, often stunned or injured. Before it can recover, another team has positioned their sling, and as the dazed animal stumbles into its path, it is launched into the air again. The crowd of nobles erupts in laughter and applause. They cheer for the highest toss, for a particularly acrobatic tumble from the fox, or for a direct hit if the animal happens to land on. The scene that follows is one of utter savagery. The bear, despite being chained, is a formidable opponent. It rises onto its hind legs, roaring in fury and pain, and swats at the dogs with its massive paws. A single blow can send a dog flying, its back broken. But the dogs are relentless. They leap and bite, tearing at the bear's legs, its flanks, its sensitive nose. The sand in the pit darkens with blood, both the bears and the dogs. The crowd loves it. They roar with every successful attack by the dogs and groan with every canine casualty. They place bets on how many dogs the bear will kill before it succumbs, or how long it will take for the dogs to bring the bear down. It's a sickening spectacle, a raw display of violence for its own sake. There is no pretense of noble skill like in the joust, or communal rivalry like in mob football. This is pure, unadulterated bloodlust, packaged as entertainment. Bear baiting was incredibly popular, especially in England. The Paris Garden in London was a famous bear baiting arena, a major tourist attraction that drew crowds for centuries. It wasn't just a low-class affair. Nobility and royalty were avid fans. Queen Elizabeth I was known to enjoy the spectacle and even entertained foreign ambassadors with it. The cost of a bear and the powerful mastiffs required to fight it meant that staging such an event required a significant investment, making it a professional, commercial enterprise. The bear would often not be killed. A good feisty bear was a valuable asset, and a bear ward would want to use it for multiple shows. After a certain amount of time, or when the bear was too injured to continue, the dogs would be called off, and the bleeding, exhausted animal would be led back to its pen to recover, only to be chained to the stake again the following week. And it wasn't just bears. The basic formula could be adapted. Bull baiting was also common, where a bull would be tethered and attacked by dogs. It was so common, in fact, that in some towns, a law required that any bull to be slaughtered for meat had to be baited first, under the strange and almost certainly false belief that the frenzy of the fight tenderized the meat. But the variations could get even more bizarre. One of the quirkier and more cruel fringe spectacles was cat burning. On certain festival days, particularly in France, a bag or barrel full of live cats would be hoisted onto a public bonfire. The terrified shrieks of the cats as they were burned alive were considered a source of great amusement for the watching crowd. Historians still debate the twisted logic behind this, suggesting it may have been linked to a superstition that associated cats with the devil or witchcraft, and that their cries would drive away evil spirits. As you watch the brutal scene in the bear pit, you can't help but wonder what it says about the medieval psyche. Life was cheap, and death was a constant public presence. People were desensitized to suffering in a way that is hard for us to comprehend. The line between humans and animals was sharply drawn. The prevailing religious and philosophical view was that animals did not have souls, and were placed on earth for man's use and entertainment. The suffering of the bear or the dogs was simply not a moral consideration for the vast majority of the audience. It was no different than watching the wind blow through the trees, powdered wig and a dead badger, a testament to the strange and disturbing ways that the wealthy found to amuse themselves, proving that cruelty could be just as entertaining in a pristine garden as it was in a bloody pit. You step away from the surreal cruelty of the aristocratic garden party, back into the world of the common folk. The manicured lawns and silk gowns are replaced by the familiar sight of a village green on a Sunday afternoon after church. The air is clear, the mood is relaxed but focused. A group of men and older boys are gathered at one end of the green, their conversation low and serious. They are yeomen, craftsmen and farmers, the sturdy, self-reliant backbone of the English countryside. You've arrived at the archery butts. This is a raised mound of earth, about 6 feet high and 20 feet wide, with a turf face. Set into the turf are the targets, simple circular pieces of wood or woven straw, with a painted mark in the centre. The men are standing a significant distance away, some as far as 220 yards, the standard military range. This isn't a casual game of darts. It's a serious practice mandated by the law of the land. You watch as a tall, broad-shouldered man takes his position. He's holding not a simple bow, but an English longbow. It's a formidable weapon, 6 feet long and made from a single stave of yew wood. The string is thick, made of hemp or flax. To draw this bow requires immense strength, an estimated draw weight of over 100 pounds, sometimes as high as 150. Modern archers typically train with bows half that strength. The physical toll of being a longbowman was so great that archaeologists can identify their skeletons by their overdeveloped left arms, curved spines, and bone spurs on their shoulders and wrists. The archer places his feet, nocks an arrow, a 3-foot-long shaft fletched with goose feathers, and begins to draw. It's not a quick, fluid motion. It's a slow, deliberate application of immense power. He brings the string back to his ear, his whole body a tense spring of potential energy. He pauses for a heartbeat, aims, and releases. The arrow flies with a sound that is part hiss, part hum. It travels in a high arc, seeming to hang in the air for a moment, before plummeting back to earth with incredible speed. It strikes the turf butt with a solid, satisfying thump. It's a near-perfect shot just inches from the centre mark. A few of the other men nod in appreciation. This weekly practice was made compulsory by a series of royal decrees, most famously the archery law of 1363 issued by King Edward III. This law required every able-bodied man to another participant. It's treated as a light-hearted, comical garden party game, like a 3-legged race or a game of croquet, but with a living, terrified projectile. This was a genuine and surprisingly popular courtly pastime, particularly in parts of the Germanic states. The most famous enthusiast was Augustus II the Strong, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, who hosted enormous fox-tossing events at his court in Dresden. At one such event it was recorded that 687 foxes, 533 hares, 34 badgers, and 21 wildcats were tossed and killed. It was a spectacle of immense cruelty, disguised as a playful competition. Sometimes the participants would dress up in costumes for the event, with some records describing them dressed as mythological figures like gods and goddesses, adding a layer of surreal theatrical absurdity to the proceedings. Imagine a man in a Roman centurion costume and a woman dressed as Diana, the huntress, gleefully launching a badger 20 feet into the air. The goal was not just to toss the animal, but eventually to kill it. The repeated falls would cause internal injuries, broken bones, and eventually death. While it seems utterly barbaric to you, the participants saw it as a harmless diversion. The animals, foxes, badgers, wildcats, were considered vermin. In their worldview, this was no different from setting a trap or going on a hunt. The fact that it was turned into a festive social game was simply a bonus. You watch as a particularly panicked fox, after being tossed, turns on its tormentors. It snaps and bites at the ankles and silk stockings of the nobles standing nearby, creating a brief, comical flurry of shrieks and hopping as the finely dressed aristocrats try to avoid its teeth. This was apparently a common and much enjoyed part of the fun. The small element of danger, the risk of a bite from a fox or a scratch from a wildcat, only added to the thrill of the game. Historians still argue about the deeper cultural meaning of such a bizarre sport. Was it merely a callous display of aristocratic power over the natural world, a symbolic taming of the wild? Or was it a reflection of a society where casual cruelty was so deeply ingrained that the suffering of an animal was simply invisible, not registering as something to be concerned about? It's a stark illustration of a completely different set of ethical goalposts. A quirky and even darker fringe variation of this activity didn't involve slings. Sometimes, for a carnival or festival, nobles would use specially trained dogs to chase cats up a specially constructed greased pole. At the top of the pole was a small platform with a box. The cat, seeing it as a refuge, would leap into the box, which was actually a trigger for a set of fireworks. The cat's weight would ignite the fuses, creating a spectacular display that would, of course, terrify and often kill the animal inside. As the sun begins to set over the lavish garden party, the ground is littered with the bodies of the tossed animals. The game is winding down. The nobles, their faces flushed with wine and excitement, are moving on to the evening's ball. They leave the carnage behind for the servants to clean up, their laughter echoing in the twilight. You are left with the quiet, surreal image of a practice with the longbow on Sundays and holidays. All other sports, like the mob football you witnessed earlier, were forbidden on these days to ensure that this vital military skill was maintained. The longbow was the English superweapon of the 100 Years' War. At battles like Crecy and Agincourt, waves of English and Welsh longbowmen unleashed devastating volleys of arrows, darkening the sky and mowing down the flower of French chivalry before they could even get close. The practice at the butts was therefore a cornerstone of national defence, but it was also much more than that. It was a primary form of village recreation, a social event, and a stage for personal rivalries, and a display of masculine pride. Being the best archer in the village was a significant source of status. Competitions were held regularly, with prizes like a silver arrow or a purse of coins. The legend of Robin Hood, a folk hero whose defining skill was his unmatched mastery of the bow, speaks to how deeply archery was embedded in the English cultural identity. You see a younger man step up to shoot. He's cocky, trying to shoot too quickly. He fumbles with his arrow, and when he finally looses it, it wobbles in the air and lands far short of the target, skittering uselessly along the grass. An older man claps him on the shoulder, offering a few quiet words of advice. It's a moment of teaching, of passing down knowledge from one generation to the next. This skill was not just for war. The longbow was used for hunting, putting food on the table, and it was used for settling scores. While the law demanded practice, the presence of 100 men armed with deadly weapons could easily lead to trouble. There are court records detailing brawls and even killings that erupted at the archery butts, often over a disputed bet or a simmering personal grudge. An accidental misfire in the direction of a rival was a convenient, if risky, way to make a point. A quirky and somewhat less lethal aspect of archery culture involved clout shooting, where the target was not a butt but a small piece of cloth or wood placed on the ground at extreme distances, sometimes up to 240 yards. The goal was simply to land your arrow as close to the clout as possible, requiring an incredible ability to judge wind and distance. It was the medieval equivalent of a long drive competition in golf. Historians still argue about how effective the compulsory archery laws truly were. While they undoubtedly helped maintain a large pool of trained archers for military campaigns, some scholars suggest that by the late medieval period, enthusiasm was waning. The rise of early firearms, though less accurate and slower to load, required far less strength and lifelong training. The government's repeated insistence that men practice suggests that many would have preferred to spend their Sunday afternoons drinking in the tavern or playing other, more forbidden games. The last archer of the group takes his turn. He's an old man, his back bent, but his arms are still thick with muscle. He draws the bow with the familiar ease of a lifetime of practice. His arrow flies true, landing dead center in the target. He doesn't smile or boast, just gives a slow, satisfied nod. He has proven once again that he is a man to be respected. The afternoon's practice is over. The men gather their arrows, discussing the shots, their conversation a mix of technical detail and village gossip. They are heading inevitably towards the tavern you first visited to quench the thirst they've earned from their martial fun. You leave the serious, state-mandated fun of the archery butts and find yourself drawn back inside, into the great hall of a manor house after a festive meal. The trestle tables have been cleared away, creating a large open space on the stone floor. The fire in the great hearth crackles merrily, casting a warm, flickering light on the assembled group. It's a mix of ages, the lord and lady of the house, their children, their household staff, and perhaps some visiting guests. The mood is light and playful, a world away from the deadly seriousness of the tournament or the grim focus of the archers. Tonight they are playing indoor games, the kind of parlor games that have been passed down for generations. A young woman is being blindfolded with a thick silk scarf. The game is about to begin. Hoodman's blind, the direct ancestor of modern blind man's buff. The blindfolded player, the hoodman, is spun around a few times until they are disoriented. The other players then form a circle around them. The goal is for the hoodman to catch one of the other players. The players in the circle, however, are not silent. They taunt, they tease, they call out the hoodman's name from different directions to confuse them, and they are armed. Each player has a small knotted piece of cloth, or a soft leather glove. As the hoodman stumbles about, arms outstretched, the other players dart in, give them a light smack on the back or arm with their knotted cloth, and then dart away again, dissolving into laughter. The hoodman flails, lurching towards the sound of a giggle, only to find empty air. It's a game of gentle, teasing torment. The slaps aren't meant to cause real pain, but they add a small, physical sting to the frustration of being unable to see. It's a game that relies on sound, touch, and a bit of playful cruelty. Finally, after several near misses, the hoodman's grasping hands close around someone's arm. A cheer goes up. The captured player must then be identified. The hoodman runs their hands over the person's clothes and face, trying to guess who they've caught. A correct guess means the captured player becomes the new hoodman. An incorrect guess means the ordeal continues. This game was incredibly popular across all social classes, from peasants in a barn to courtiers in a castle. It appears in medieval art and literature, a common symbol of festive communal fun. Yet, like many things from this era, it had a darker side. The name hoodman likely refers to the hood worn by a criminal being led to execution. The game, in a way, is a playful reenactment of a grim public spectacle, turning the helplessness of a condemned man into a source of laughter. As the game of Hoodman's Blind winds down, another one begins, this one even more peculiar to your modern eyes. A young man, one of the visiting squires, kneels down and buries his face in the lap of one of the ladies of the house, who is seated on a large carved chair. He places one of his hands behind his back, palm facing upwards. The game is called Hot Cockles. The other players gather around. One by one, they take turns lightly slapping the squire's upturned palm. After each slap, the squire, who cannot see who struck him, must guess the identity of the slapper. If he guesses correctly, the person who slapped him takes his place. If he guesses incorrectly, he receives another slap from a different player, and the game continues. It's a strange, intimate, and slightly risque game. The act of kneeling with one's head in a lady's lap has clear undertones of courtly submission and flirtation. The slapping, even though gentle, is a form of physical contact that would normally be outside the bounds of polite interaction. It's a game of trust and social navigation. You have to know your fellow players well enough to recognise their touch, or perhaps the sound of their rustling sleeve as they approach. It's a test of social awareness disguised as a silly parlour game. The name itself, Hot Cockles, is a bit of a mystery. Cockles was a medieval slang term for the folds of a woman's wimple or headdress, but it also had more vulgar connotations. Historians still argue whether the name is an innocent piece of nonsense or a deliberately cheeky double entendre, a hidden joke that all the players would have understood. It's a perfect example of how medieval fun often walked a fine line between piety and bawdiness. A fringe, and much rougher, version of these slapping games was played among soldiers and apprentices called tugging the king. One player would be chosen as the king and would sit on a stool. The other players would try to pull him off the stool, while he was allowed to freely slap them with a piece of leather or a soft club as they approached. It was a chaotic free-for-all that often devolved from a game into a genuine brawl, a testament to how easily play could slide into real aggression. Back in the Great Hall, the squire has just guessed correctly. A young lady, blushing and laughing, has been identified as the one who slapped his hand. It is now her turn to kneel, but the lord of the manor claps his hands and declares it's time for music. The games of pain and slapping are over for the evening. You're left marvelling at how these simple physical games serve to break down social barriers, allowing for a level of playful physical contact and gentle humiliation that was both a bonding experience and a subtle reinforcement of the very social hierarchies they seemed to be mocking. They were simple, they required no equipment save a blindfold, and they reveal a world where fun was often just a slap away. The warm firelit hall of the manor fades, and you find yourself back outside in the biting cold of a winter's night. Snow lies thick on the ground, muffling all sound and glowing faintly under the light of a full moon. You're in a small village, the thatched roofs of the cottages heavy with white blankets. It's the heart of the Christmas season, a time not just of religious observance, but of deep-seated folk traditions. A strange procession is making its way down the narrow, unlit street. At first, they are just dark shapes moving against the snow, but as they draw closer, you see they are a group of villagers, about a dozen of them, transformed into grotesque and comical figures by elaborate disguises. This is a troop of mummers. Their faces are hidden behind crude masks made of painted leather, cloth, or even the dried, hollowed-out heads of animals like horses or goats. Their costumes are a bizarre patchwork of mismatched clothes, often worn inside out or backwards, with straw stuffed into their shirts to make them look fat or misshapen. Some are dressed as the opposite gender, men in women's dresses and bonnets, their faces smudged with soot. They are deliberately unsettling otherworldly figures. Their goal is to be unrecognisable to their neighbours. They move in silence, save for the crunch of their boots on the snow and the jingle of small bells tied to their ankles. They stop before the door of a larger house, perhaps that of the village reeve or a prosperous farmer. One of them, the leader, knocks loudly. When the door opens, spilling a rectangle of warm light onto the snow, the mummers don't speak. Instead, they communicate through gestures, pointing at their mouths and bellies, indicating their desire for food and drink. The homeowner, far from being alarmed, grins in recognition of the tradition. This is an expected part of the holiday festivities. The mummers are invited inside. Once in the warmth of the house, the performance begins. It's a short, crude, and very loud folk play. The plot is simple and has been performed in countless variations for centuries. The core characters are always present. A heroic figure, often St. George, a nod to England's patron saint, a villainous opponent like a Turkish knight or a comical dragon, and a doctor with a magic potion. The play erupts in the centre of the room. St. George, played by a strapping young farmer, delivers boastful rhyming lines about his prowess. The Turkish knight, a much smaller man made to look fierce by a painted mask and a wooden sword, retorts with his own threats. Their dialogue is formulaic, passed down orally from generation to generation. They fight. Their swordplay is clumsy and exaggerated, more like a slapstick routine than a real duel. Inevitably, St. George is struck down and falls dead to the floor. This is the dramatic climax. The other characters lament his passing with theatrical wailing. Then, the doctor is called for. A man with a false beard and a comically oversized bag of cures bustles in. He proclaims in a squeaky voice that he can cure any ailment, from a broken leg to the plague. He administers his elixir, likely a swig of ale from a bottle, to the fallen hero. Miraculously, St. George springs back to life, and the play ends with a dance and a song. The theme is always the same, death and resurrection. It's a deeply pagan idea, rooted in ancient winter solstice rituals that predate Christianity by millennia. The play is a symbolic representation of the death of the old year and the birth of the new, a magical charm to ensure the return of the sun and the fertility of the land. Having performed their duty, the mummers are rewarded. The homeowner provides them with ale, mince pies, and perhaps a few pennies. They accept their payment, again, mostly in silence, and then file back out into the cold night, on their way to the next house. The anonymity is crucial. Part of the fun for the homeowners is trying to guess who is behind the masks based on their height, their walk, or a familiar gesture. Historians still argue about the precise origins of mumming. Is it a direct, unbroken line from pre-Christian rites? Or is it a more medieval invention that simply uses older symbolic language? The plays themselves are a fascinating hodgepodge of Christian figures like St. George, folk characters like the Doctor, and purely comical additions like Beelzebub or Little Johnny Jack. A quirky and particularly disruptive fringe element of this tradition was the hobby horse. In some mumming troupes, one performer would be dressed in a large elaborate horse costume, often made of a wooden frame covered in cloth. This character would be deliberately chaotic, charging at the audience, snapping its wooden jaws, and generally causing a delightful sort of mayhem, a symbol of untamed nature crashing the party. The practice of mumming, of going door to door in disguise to perform for treats, is the direct ancestor of modern trick-or-treating at Halloween. But here, it's not just for children. It's a vital, adult-led community ritual. It's a way of strengthening social bonds, of visiting every house in the village and reaffirming that everyone is part of the same collective, even if for one night they are pretending to be monstrous strangers. It's a brief, sanctioned moment of misrule, a temporary suspension of normal identity, where for a few hours you can become someone, or something, else entirely. As the mummers disappear into the darkness, you're left with the echo of their strange rhyming play, a piece of living folklore trudging through the snow. The festive, ritualised chaos of the mummers in their masks gives way to a more widespread and far more radical form of social upheaval. You find yourself in the heart of a bustling medieval cathedral town, not during the quiet reverence of a normal church service, but during the wild, anarchic period between Christmas and Epiphany. The air, which should be filled with the scent of incense and the sound of solemn plainsong, is instead thick with the smell of roasting meat from street vendors and echoing with raucous laughter and drunken singing. This is the Feast of Fools. It's a day, or sometimes a series of days, dedicated to the principle of topsy-turvy. It's the world turned upside down, a tradition particularly cherished by the junior clergy. The subdeacons, clerks and choir boys who spent the rest of the year at the bottom of the strict ecclesiastical hierarchy. Today, they are in charge. You watch as a strange procession spills out of the grand cathedral doors. At its head is the Lord of Misrule, or the boy bishop, a young choir boy who has been elected by his peers to preside over the day's festivities. He is dressed in the full, magnificent vestments of the actual bishop, complete with a mitre on his head and a miniature crozier in his hand. He walks with a comical swagger, mimicking the solemn gait of the man whose authority he has temporarily usurped. Following him are other junior clerics, dressed in the robes of canons and deans. Some are wearing their vestments inside out. Others are wearing grotesque masks, similar to the mummers you saw, or have their faces painted. Instead of swinging censers filled with fragrant incense, they are burning old leather shoes and scraps of sausage, creating a foul, stinking smoke that they wave in the faces of the laughing crowd. They are not singing sacred hymns, they are braying like donkeys, a sound that echoes strangely in the hallowed space of the cathedral close. This part of the ceremony was sometimes called the Feast of the Ass, supposedly in honour of the donkey that carried Mary to Bethlehem, but it was really just an excuse for loud, irreverent noise. The procession moves through the church itself. They eat, drink and play dice on the high altar, a place of ultimate sanctity. They sing bawdy, satirical songs that mock the church liturgy and the senior clergy. The boy bishop delivers a sermon, a parody full of nonsensical theology and jokes at the expense of his superiors, who are often required to watch the proceedings with a forced smile. This wasn't a protest or a rebellion. For a long time it was a sanctioned, tolerated custom. The senior clergy often went along with it, seeing it as a necessary release valve. The idea, inherited from the Roman festival of Saturnalia, was that a little bit of controlled chaos could help preserve order for the rest of the year. By allowing the world to go mad for one day, you inoculated it against true anarchy. As one 15th century Parisian theologian wrote in its defence, "The folly that is our second nature can have its vent once a year." The fun and the chaos spills out into the town square. The boy bishop and his retinue are pulled through the streets on a decorated cart, blessing the crowds with splashes of holy water from a bucket. They demand rents and taxes from onlookers, collecting money that would later be spent on a massive feast and drinking session for the junior clergy. It's a powerful and deeply subversive spectacle. For a day, the powerless are powerful, the sacred is made profane, the solemnity of the church is replaced by the riot of the carnival. It's a vivid demonstration of what the Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin would later call the carnivalesque, a spirit of folk culture that celebrates the grotesque, the bodily, and the inversion of all official hierarchy. Of course, the church authorities were deeply ambivalent about the whole thing. The line between sanctioned fun and outright blasphemy was incredibly thin. Numerous church councils from the 13th century onwards tried to condemn and suppress the Feast of Fools, calling it scandalous and impious. They were particularly offended by the mockery of the Mass and the use of the church building for what amounted to a drunken party. Historians still argue whether the Feast of Fools was genuinely a tool for social cohesion, as its defenders claimed, or a genuinely dangerous and corrosive force that threatened the very foundations of church authority. A quirky fringe element of this tradition was the sermon joyeux, or comic sermon, which sometimes took place during the festivities. A member of the clergy, or sometimes a professional fool, would deliver a parody sermon in praise of something ridiculous, like a goose, drunkenness, or the virtues of a scolding wife. It was a form of sophisticated literary and theological parody that coexisted with the cruder, more physical comedy of the main event. As the day wears on, the festivities become more and more unhinged. You see the boy bishop, his mitre askew, being carried on the shoulders of his canons, all of them singing a drinking song at the top of their lungs. The temporary madness has reached its peak. Tomorrow, the real bishop will be back in charge. The subdeacons will be back to their menial duties and order will be restored. But for this one glorious chaotic day, the fools ruled the world. Their reign, however, was confined to the church and the streets. A different, more organised form of public spectacle was about to take place, one that harnessed the power of storytelling on a grand, mobile scale. The chaotic, subversive energy of the Feast of Fools recedes, replaced by a different kind of public festival. The date has moved forward to the Feast of Corpus Christi, a celebration in early summer. You're standing on a crowded, sun-drenched street in a prosperous English city like York, Chester, or Coventry. The atmosphere is festive, but it's an organised civic festivity, not. Your walk is over. You've reached the door to the small chamber where you'll sleep. You pause one last time, the whole chaotic, vibrant and terrifying tapestry of medieval fun laid out in your memory. It was a world of profound faith and profound cruelty, of deep community and stark hierarchy, of sacred beauty and grotesque humour. Their fun was rarely just for fun. It was for status, for salvation, for survival, and for making sense of a life that was often short, hard, and unforgiving. And now, it is time for rest. You push open the heavy wooden door and step into the small, quiet space of your room. The only light comes from a single tallow candle left for you on a small table, its flame flickering gently, casting long, soft shadows that dance upon the stone walls. The air is still and cool. In the corner of the room is a simple bed, a wooden frame with a mattress stuffed with straw, which rustles faintly as you move closer. The clamour of the world you have just journeyed through, the roar of the tournament crowd, the clang of the charivari, the splintering of lances and the splash of the mob in the river, all of it begins to recede, becoming a distant and fading echo. Those vivid, sometimes harsh realities of the past soften and blur, their sharp edges smoothed away by the quiet of this sanctuary. The world of struggle and strange joy is now just a story, a series of images floating gently in the back of your mind. As you settle into the quiet, letting the day's journey dissolve, you can feel the heavy pull of sleep beginning to take hold, a welcome gravity after so much wandering. The flickering candle flame seems to slow, the shadows seem to deepen, and the great silent peace of the medieval night, which holds both terrors and a profound tranquillity, begins to wrap around you like a heavy, comforting blanket. All the noise is gone now. There is only the soft light, the gentle quiet, and the deep restorative promise of sleep. The world outside this room can wait. Your own bed is here, safe and warm. The story is over. It is time to drift. It is time to dream. The anarchic release of the Christmas revels. The entire town has turned out, lining the streets, jostling for a good view. What they are waiting for is the great Corpus Christi procession, the centrepiece of which is the performance of the mystery plays. This is theatre on a grand, epic scale, a form of entertainment that also serves as a public declaration of faith, civic pride, and economic power. Suddenly you hear the rumble of wooden wheels on cobblestones and the sound of a trumpet blast. The first act is about to arrive. The stage is a pageant wagon, a large heavy cart with a wooden platform on top. It's essentially a mobile theatrical set. This first wagon is decorated to look like the heavens, painted with stars and clouds. On its upper level, a man with a flowing white beard and a golden crown, representing God the Father, is seated on a throne. He raises his hand, and in a booming voice begins to speak the opening lines of the story of creation. This is the start of a cycle of plays that will last the entire day, from sunrise to sunset. Each play depicts a different story from the Bible, from the Garden of Eden and Noah's flood to the Nativity of Christ, and the final terrifying spectacle of the Last Judgment. The entire Christian narrative, the complete history of the world as they understood it, is being performed in sequence right here on the streets of the city. The production of these plays was a massive community effort, organised and funded by the city's powerful trade guilds. Each guild was responsible for staging one particular play, and the assignments were often delightfully appropriate. The Shipwrights Guild, for example, would be responsible for the story of Noah's Ark, a chance to show off their boat-building skills. The bakers would stage the Last Supper, with its focus on bread. The goldsmiths might handle the story of the Three Magi, which involved precious gifts. This was a source of intense competition and pride. Each guild wanted their pageant wagon to be the most spectacular, their costumes the most lavish, their special effects the most convincing. You watch as the creation wagon moves on down the street to the next designated performance spot, and a new one rumbles into view. This one is for the story of Adam and Eve. The actors, likely a master craftsman and his wife from the Drapers Guild, are dressed in flesh-coloured leather suits to simulate nudity, a daring but necessary costume choice. The serpent might be a cleverly articulated wooden puppet, whispering temptation into Eve's ear. These were not professional actors in the modern sense. They were ordinary citizens, bakers, weavers, and smiths, who devoted weeks of their time to rehearsing their roles. The dialogue was written in rhyming vernacular English, making it accessible to the entire populace, most of whom were illiterate and would have experienced these biblical stories primarily through sermons and church art. The special effects were a key part of the appeal. For the play of Noah's flood, the Vintners Guild might use barrels of water poured from the roof of the wagon to simulate rain. For the hellmouth scene in the Last Judgment play, the wagon would be constructed to look like the gaping, monstrous mouth of a demon, with real smoke and firecrackers belching out as devils dragged the souls of the damned inside. It was thrilling, terrifying, and spectacular. Imagine a modern parade float that's also a live-action fire-breathing horror show. A quirky and often problematic part of these plays was the character of Herod. In the Nativity plays, King Herod was almost always portrayed as a comically ranting, boasting, and blaspheming tyrant. He would storm around the stage, threatening the audience and delivering his lines with such over-the-top fury that it became a theatrical trope. The phrase, to out-Herod Herod, meaning to behave in an excessively dramatic or blustering manner, even found its way into Shakespeare's Hamlet, a testament to how well known this character type was. Historians still argue about the primary purpose of these plays. Were they genuinely devotional acts, intended to deepen the public's faith and understanding of Scripture? Or were they more of a civic spectacle, a way for the guilds to display their wealth, and for the city to project an image of unity and prosperity? The truth, as is often the case, is likely a mixture of both. It was religious education and blockbuster entertainment rolled into one. It was a day when the sacred story was made immediate, tangible, and thrillingly real for everyone to see. The final pageant wagon of the day creaks into view. It is the Hellmouth, operated by the Cooks or Butchers Guild. Devils with pitchforks, played by apprentices in hairy costumes and demonic masks, caper and cackle, grabbing damned souls, other apprentices, from the crowd and tossing them into the smoky, fiery maw. It's a terrifying and deliberately didactic conclusion to the day's entertainment. The message is clear. This is what awaits the sinner. As the wagon rumbles past, leaving a faint smell of sulphur in the air, you're left with a powerful impression of a community that used theatre not for escapism, but to confront the biggest questions of life, death, and eternity, all while enjoying a day out in the sun. You move away from the crowded city streets and the epic drama of the mystery plays. The world becomes quieter, greener, and more expansive. You find yourself on horseback, riding out from a castle on a crisp autumn morning. The rising sun burns the mist off the fields, and the air is sharp and clean. You're part of a small, exclusive party. At its head is a nobleman, and beside him, a noblewoman, both elegantly dressed for the ride. But the true star of this expedition is not human. It is perched regally on the gloved fist of the nobleman. You are about to witness the noble art of falconry, or hawking. The bird on the Lord's gauntlet is a peregrine falcon, one of the most prized birds of prey. Its feathers are a slate grey and white, its eyes dark and fiercely intelligent. A small, ornate leather hood covers its head, keeping it calm, forward to retrieve both the bird and its prey. The falcon is rewarded with a small piece of meat from the kill, reinforcing the training. This was the height of aristocratic sport. It was a display of wealth. A well-trained falcon could cost more than a warhorse. Skill, both the falconers and the lords, and power over the natural world. It was a clean, elegant, and highly aestheticized form of hunting. There was no mud or blood in the same way as a boar hunt, and it could be enjoyed by both men and women. Noble women were often passionate and skilled falconers themselves. Historians still argue about whether falconry was more a sport or a status symbol. While it did provide food for the table, a dish of heron or duck was a welcome addition to a feast. The effort and expense involved were wildly disproportionate to the practical return. The real prize was not the dead duck, it was the thrill of the chase, the beauty of the falcon's flight, and the public demonstration of one's refined taste and social standing. A quirky fringe element of falconry involved the use of lures, fake birds made of leather and feathers, which the falconer would swing on a long cord to call the hawk back if it was being uncooperative, or if there was no live prey to be found. Some of these lures were incredibly elaborate, decorated with silver and jewels, becoming status objects in their own right. The party turns for home, the successful hunt adding to the festive mood. The falcon is hooded once more, its work for the day done. It sits calmly on the lord's glove, a living symbol of aristocratic privilege and the complex, beautiful and deadly dance between man, animal and the sky. This intricate dance of control and nature was not just played out in the fields, but also in the subtle, unspoken games of the royal court itself. You leave the open skies of the hunt and enter the much more confined, though no less dangerous environment of a royal court or a great ducal household. The air is no longer crisp and clean, but heavy with the scents of beeswax candles, expensive perfumes, and the simmering undercurrent of political ambition. Stone walls are covered with rich tapestries, and the floors are strewn with sweet-smelling herbs, a slight improvement on the greasy rushes of the tavern. Here the fun is subtle, intellectual, and deadly serious. You're about to witness the game of courtly love. This is not a physical sport with a clear winner and loser. It's a complex and highly ritualized code of conduct, a social and literary game that governed the interactions between elite men and women. At its centre is a knight or a courtier who devotes himself to the service of a noble and focused until the moment of the hunt. This bird is not a pet. It is a highly trained, incredibly valuable hunting partner. The sport of falconry is ancient, with origins in the steppes of Asia, but it was adopted with immense passion by the medieval European aristocracy. It was a sport that was steeped in status and symbolism. The type of hawk you were legally allowed to fly was strictly dictated by your social rank. According to one famous list from the 15th century Boke of St Albans, a king would fly a gerfalcon, a prince a peregrine, a knight a saker, and so on, all the way down to a knave or servant, who was permitted only to fly a kestrel. Owning the wrong bird was a serious social faux pas, and stealing a valuable hawk was a crime punishable by severe fines or even imprisonment. The falconer, a man who walks alongside the lord's horse, is a figure of immense skill and importance. He is a master of animal husbandry and psychology. He has spent months, even years, training this falcon. The process, known as manning, involves gradually acclimating the wild bird to human presence, first by carrying it on the glove for hours on end, then by teaching it to accept food from the hand, and finally, by training it to fly free and return on command. It's a relationship built on a delicate balance of trust, repetition, and reward. The hunting party moves across the open fields until they reach a riverbank, a place where waterfowl are likely to be found. A group of servants, accompanied by small, energetic dogs, moves ahead, their job being to flush the prey from the reeds and grasses. Suddenly the dogs begin to bark excitedly. A flock of ducks, startled from their resting place, explodes into the air, wings beating frantically. This is the moment. The nobleman quickly and expertly removes the hood from his falcon. The bird's eyes, suddenly exposed to the light, take in the scene in an instant. The lord raises his arm, and with a slight upward flick releases the bird. The falcon needs no encouragement. It pumps its wings powerfully, climbing into the sky with astonishing speed. Unlike a human archer, whose arrow flies in a predictable arc, the hawk is a living weapon, capable of adapting its attack in mid-air. The falcon circles high above, a mere speck against the blue sky, positioning itself over the flock of ducks. This is called waiting on. The party on the ground stops, all eyes turned upward, watching the drama unfold. Then the falcon makes its move. It tucks its wings and dives, a maneuver called a stoop, It plummets towards the earth at speeds that can exceed 200 miles per hour, making it the fastest animal on the planet. The air rushes past its streamlined body with a faint whistling sound. It singles out one duck from the flock and aims not to grab it, but to strike it. The falcon hits the duck in mid-air with its balled-up talons, a concussive blow like a fist of stone. The duck, often killed instantly by the impact, tumbles from the sky. The falcon, its momentum spent, swoops gracefully after its quarry, landing near it on the ground. The falconer then hurries, a case, for example, asking whether it is possible to be in love with two people at once. The ladies would hear arguments and issue a verdict. While it's highly unlikely these were formal legal courts, the idea of them points to how much courtly love was seen as a system with rules and principles that could be debated, almost like a form of law or theology. You watch as the countess, leaving her husband's side to speak with another lady, passes by the young knight. She doesn't speak to him, but for a fleeting moment their eyes meet. She gives him a barely perceptible nod, a flicker of acknowledgement. The knight's face, which was a mask of stoic longing, breaks into a subtle, private smile. For him, that tiny interaction is a major victory, a sign that his performance of devotion has been noticed and accepted. This game required constant vigilance, an ability to read subtle social cues, and a mastery of unspoken rules. A misstep could lead to public humiliation, or, worse, the deadly jealousy of a powerful husband. It was a high-stakes game of emotional chess, played out in the glittering, claustrophobic world of the court. While the courtiers played their subtle games of the heart, another group, a much more rebellious and less refined one, was playing with words in a very different way. You drift away from the perfumed, politically charged atmosphere of the court, leaving behind the silent, longing glances of the knights and ladies. Your journey takes you back out onto the open road, the main artery of medieval life. It's here, trudging between towns, universities and monasteries, that you encounter a very different kind of wordsmith, a figure far removed from the refined courtly poet. You fall in step with a group of young men, their clothes dusty and well-travelled, their faces sharp with intelligence and a hint of dissolution. These are the goliards. They are in essence dropout scholars. They are wandering students and renegade junior clergy, men who have a university education, a rare and valuable thing, but have rejected the traditional career paths of the church, law or medicine. They possess the intellectual tools of the elite, a mastery of Latin, a knowledge of classical literature and theology, but they have chosen a life of wandering, poverty and defiant hedonism. Their fun is found in wit, satire and a complete rejection of the establishment that trained them. As you walk with them, one of them, a charismatic man with a quick, cynical smile, pulls a small flask from his satchel, takes a long drink and begins to sing. The song is not in the vernacular English of the tavern minstrel, but in crisp, clever Latin, the universal language of the educated class. But this is not a hymn or a prayer. It's a parody. He sings of the glories of the tavern, praising the virtues of wine over water and gambling over prayer. He sings about the pleasures, lady, who is usually married and of higher social standing. He pledges his undying, unswerving loyalty to her, promising to perform great deeds in her honour. She, in turn, becomes his inspiration, his guiding star, the object of his idealised and often unrequited passion. You observe a young knight, fresh from the quintain field and perhaps even a real tournament, standing in a crowded hall. His eyes are fixed on a beautiful countess who is seated near the high table, engaged in conversation with her much older, powerful husband. The knight does not approach her directly. That would be a disastrous breach of etiquette. Instead, the game is played through glances, sighs, and coded language. He might wear a sleeve of a colour she favours, a subtle signal that only she, and everyone else who is paying attention, will understand. The fun of courtly love was in its performance. It was a kind of romantic theatre. A courtier would write poetry celebrating his lady's beauty and virtue, comparing her to a rose, a star, or the Virgin Mary. He might compose songs to be sung by a minstrel, lamenting the pain of his unfulfilled love. Remember the minstrel in the tavern singing of Sir John. Here, the songs are not of battle, but of a heart wounded by a glance from a beautiful woman. These performances were public, meant to be overheard and appreciated by the entire court, as a display of the courtier's wit, sensitivity, and refined manners. The lady, for her part, plays a role of cool, distant perfection. She might reward her suitor's devotion with a small token of her favour. A glove, a ribbon, a smile. This small gesture would be enough to send the knight into raptures of joy and inspire him to even greater feats, like, for instance, volunteering for a particularly dangerous charge in the next joust you witnessed. The entire affair was supposed to be chaste, an ennobling passion of the spirit rather than the flesh. The love was a motivating force, a way to civilize the aggressive instincts of the warrior class and channel them into more refined pursuits like poetry and chivalrous deeds. Of course, the line between idealized love and actual adultery was a blurry and dangerous one. The most famous literary expressions of this code, the stories of Lancelot and Queen Guinevere or Tristan and Isolde, are precisely about this line being crossed, with tragic consequences. These stories, immensely popular in courtly circles, served as both a celebration of the ideal and a cautionary tale about its potential dangers. Historians still argue fiercely about what courtly love actually was. Was it a real, lived experience, a set of rules that people genuinely tried to follow in their daily lives, or was it purely a literary invention, a fashionable game for poets and storytellers with little connection to reality? The scholar C.S. Lewis famously described it as a radical new religion of love, while others have dismissed it as little more than a flirtatious pastime. The truth is likely somewhere in between. It was a social ideal that shaped behaviour and expectations, even if people frequently failed to live up to it. A quirky and very specific part of this game was the establishment of courts of love. According to some late medieval texts, these were tribunals presided over by noblewomen, where disputes about the proper conduct of love were debated and judged. A knight might bring, "Friend, thy poverty be with thee to thy damnation." The rich man who offers a bribe is embraced and told, "Go in peace." It was a savage and deeply cynical critique of what they saw as the church's obsession with wealth, a piece of satire so sharp it could have easily gotten them burned at the stake. As night falls, you see them in their element in a town tavern. They are holding court surrounded by a mix of fascinated locals and other, more conventional travellers. They are arguing, singing and drinking. Their Latin verses and clever jokes are stark contrast to the rough, simple life around them. They are outsiders by choice, men who found their fun not in games or sports, but in the sharp, dangerous pleasure of using their education as both a shield and a weapon. Their mockery was aimed at the powerful, but the spirit of public shaming could also be turned on ordinary people, as you're about to see. You leave the company of the witty, cynical goliards and find yourself once more in a village setting, but the atmosphere is not one of festive release or quiet socialising. It's tense, hostile and incredibly loud. It's late at night, but the entire community is awake and gathered outside a small darkened cottage. They are not here to celebrate, they are here to deliver a message of public condemnation. This is a charivari, or as it was known in England, rough music. The sound is a cacophony, a deliberate and aggressive assault on the ears. People are banging on pots and pans with wooden spoons, creating a relentless clanging rhythm. Others are blowing on crude horns and whistles, adding a layer of shrill discord. Someone is rattling a chain. A group of young men are beating on a ploughshare with a hammer, a sound that rings out like a broken angry bell. It's not music. It's organised noise, a symphony of disapproval designed to be as unpleasant as possible. The target of this public shaming is inside the cottage, presumably huddled in the dark, forced to listen to this overwhelming expression of their neighbours' collective judgment. The reasons for a charivari were varied, but they almost always centred on perceived violations of community norms, particularly those related to marriage and sexual conduct. The most common trigger was a widower, or widow remarrying too quickly, especially to a much younger person. This was seen as unseemly, a betrayal of the deceased spouse, and a greedy, lustful act. Other targets included adulterous couples, husbands who were beaten by their wives, a violation of the patriarchal order, or wives who were seen as excessively scolding or dominant. The community was, in effect, policing its own moral boundaries. This wasn't official justice, of the flesh, celebrating the beauty of serving girls and the joys of a night spent in their company. This is the essence of goliardic poetry. It's a literature of inversion, taking the sacred forms and language of the church and using them for profane and satirical ends. They wrote drinking songs structured like hymns, love poems that read like prayers to Venus instead of the Virgin Mary, and most importantly, biting satires that mocked the greed and hypocrisy of the senior clergy. They were the court jesters of the intellectual world, using their wit to expose the follies of the powerful. The most famous collection of their work is the Carmina Burana, a manuscript discovered in a Bavarian monastery. The name literally means songs from Bayern. This collection, which the composer Karl Orff would later set to his famous thunderous music in the 20th century, is a perfect snapshot of the goliardic mindset. It contains songs celebrating spring, gambling, drinking, and lust, alongside fierce critiques of the Pope and the corrupting influence of money within the church. The poem In taberna quando sumus, when we are in the tavern, is a goliardic anthem, a gleeful catalogue of toasts to everyone from the prisoners to the Pope, a democratic vision of damnation where wine is the great equalizer. As the group of goliards approaches a town, they discuss their plan. They will find a tavern, like the one our journey started in, and offer to entertain the patrons. But unlike the simple minstrel singing of local heroes, their performance will be more complex. They might stage a debate, a disputatio, a formal academic exercise, but the topic will be ridiculous. Should a scholar or a knight make a better lover? They will use all the tools of formal logic and rhetoric to argue this absurd point, a performance designed to show off their learning while simultaneously mocking the very academic structures they've abandoned. Their existence was precarious. They lived by their wits, relying on the charity of sympathetic patrons, the gullibility of villagers, or their ability to win at dice. They were a constant source of irritation to the authorities. The church condemned them as vagrants and heretics, and various councils passed edicts forbidding them from performing or receiving charity. They were seen as a corrupting influence, men who had been given the gift of education, and had squandered it on a life of sin and mockery. Historians still argue about the true nature of the goliards. Were they a cohesive, self-aware, literary movement with a shared philosophical outlook? Or was goliard just a convenient catch-all term for any educated rogue or troublemaker who could string a few Latin verses together? The name itself is a mystery. It might derive from the biblical giant Goliath, reimagined as a symbol of rebellion, or from the Latin word gula, meaning gluttony. Either way, the name became synonymous with a life of learned dissipation. A quirky and revealing part of their literary output was the Gospel of the Silver Mark, a brilliant parody of the Gospels. In this text, the Pope, acting as a new Jesus, hears a dispute between a rich man and a poor man. The poor man, who can offer no money, is cast out with the words, "terrifying." This intense focus on community standards and shared belief systems was also the driving force behind another, much longer and more arduous form of medieval recreation, the pilgrimage. The jarring clamour of the charivari fades into the rhythmic shuffling sound of many feet on a dusty road. You find yourself part of a long, straggling column of people, a diverse procession moving slowly but purposefully across the landscape. There are knights and merchants on horseback, stout farmers and their wives on foot, monks in their habits, and even a pardoner with a bag full of dubious relics. You have joined a pilgrimage. On the surface, a pilgrimage is a solemn religious duty, an act of penance or devotion. The goal is to travel to a sacred shrine, to see the tomb of a saint like Thomas Becket at Canterbury, to visit the relics of St. James at Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or, for the most ambitious, to make the long and perilous journey to Rome or Jerusalem itself. But as you travel with this motley crew, you quickly realise it is much more than that. For many people, a pilgrimage was the only real holiday they would ever take, a rare opportunity to leave their village, see the world and have an adventure. It was a holy vacation. The journey itself is the main event. For the wealthy, it could be a relatively comfortable affair, with servants to carry baggage and pre-arranged lodging at monasteries along the way. For the poor, it was an arduous trek of hundreds, even thousands of miles on foot, sleeping in barns or by the side of the road and relying on the charity of others. Yet regardless of class, the road threw everyone together. A pilgrimage was a great social leveller, a place where a lord and a weaver might share a loaf of bread and a story. The fun was found in this shared experience. As the days turn into weeks, a unique camaraderie develops among the pilgrims. To pass the long hours of walking, they talk, they gossip, they complain about their feet, and most importantly, they tell stories. Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, provides the most famous literary portrait of this phenomenon. His pilgrims, on their way to Becket's shrine, engage in a storytelling competition to entertain each other, with tales ranging from noble chivalric romances to bawdy comical fables. The road becomes a mobile theatre, a university of oral literature. You listen as a merchant tells a funny story about a foolish carpenter, much like the one the minstrel sang in the tavern. A serious-faced nun, despite her pious exterior, tells a surprisingly sentimental tale. The journey is punctuated by these moments of shared entertainment, a way to build community and forget the hardships of the road. Handed down by a lord or a priest, this was grassroots social control, a form of folk justice where the punishment was public humiliation. As the noise rages, a small theatrical element is added to the proceedings. Two men bring forward a donkey. They then select a man and a woman from the crowd to play the parts of the guilty couple inside the house. The man is forced to mount the donkey facing its tail, a classic symbol of ignominy and foolishness. The woman follows behind, beating him with a stick. They are then paraded around the village, accompanied by the relentless rough music, acting out the shame of the couple they are impersonating. This performance, called the stang riding in some parts of England, made the private sin a public spectacle. The purpose of the charivari was not just to punish, but to pressure. The noisy demonstration might go on for several nights in a row. The goal was to make the offenders' lives so miserable that they would either conform to the community's expectations or, in some cases, pay a fine to the organisers of the charivari to make them stop. This fine was often just an excuse to collect money for a village feast or a round of drinks at the tavern, blurring the line between moral outrage and opportunistic extortion. This practice was widespread across Europe, known by different names in different regions: charivari in France, scampanate in Italy, Katzenmusik, cat music in Germany. While the tools and rituals varied, the core idea was the same. The community had the right to regulate the behaviour of its members through public ritual and shame. The authorities, both secular and religious, had a deeply ambivalent relationship with the charivari. On one hand, it reinforced the moral standards that the church preached. On the other, it was a form of riotous, unsanctioned assembly, a usurpation of the official legal process. It could easily get out of hand, escalating from noisy protest to actual violence, with the targeted home being damaged or the occupants physically assaulted. Historians still argue whether the charivari was a legitimate expression of collective conscience, or simply a form of mob bullying, a way for the powerful factions in a village to enforce their will on the less popular. A quirky and particularly interesting aspect of the charivari is its connection to the idea of the world turned upside down, which you saw in the Feast of Fools. The ritual often involved elements of masking and cross-dressing, similar to the mummers. The participants were stepping outside of their normal roles to become agents of a chaotic, almost supernatural form of justice. By making a man ride a donkey backwards, they were symbolically inverting his status and declaring that his actions had put him outside the bounds of normal, respectable society. The noise outside the cottage finally begins to subside. The point has been made. The crowd slowly disperses, the clanging of pots and pans fading into the night. They are heading home, their sense of communal order reaffirmed. The silence that descends on the cottage is now heavier and more profound than the noise that preceded it. The occupants have been judged not in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion, an experience that was arguably far more. Your journey takes a darker turn. You leave the pilgrim road and find yourself back in a town, but the crowd gathering in the open field on its outskirts is not here for a festival or a play. The mood is sombre, tense, and expectant. A space has been cleared and roped off, much like the lists for a tournament. Two men stand in the centre of this space, stripped to the waist, their faces grim. One is a local craftsman you might have seen in the market. The other is a stranger, a man accused of a crime. You're about to witness a trial by combat. This is not a game, this is the law. In the early and high medieval period, trial by combat or judicial duel was a legitimate, legally sanctioned method for settling certain types of disputes, particularly when there was a lack of witnesses or clear evidence. It was based on the profound belief that God would intervene in the fight and grant victory to the righteous party. The outcome of the duel was not seen as a result of strength or skill, but as a direct judgment from on high, the judicium Dei. The two men are armed, but not with the noble weapons of a knight. They carry simple, unadorned shields made of wood and leather, and their weapons are heavy, crude clubs or cudgels. The choice of non-knightly weapons was deliberate, a way to distinguish this grim legal procedure from the aristocratic sport of the joust. The fight is to be decided by brute force and divine will, not by elegant swordsmanship. A priest steps forward and administers a solemn oath to both combatants. They swear on a holy relic, perhaps a saint's bone borrowed from the local church, that their cause is just and that they have not used any form of witchcraft or sorcery to aid them. The crowd is silent, watching with a mixture of fear and fascination. For them, this is not just a fight. It's a moment of direct divine communication. They are about to find out who God thinks is guilty. The rules of the combat are strict. The fight must continue until one party is killed, surrenders, or is unable to continue fighting. If the accused man loses but is not killed, he would often be executed immediately afterward, as his defeat is taken as a divine sign of his guilt. If the accuser loses, he could be punished for making a false accusation, sometimes suffering the same fate that the accused would have faced. The local sheriff or reeve gives the signal to begin. The two men circle each other warily. There is no flourish, no bravado. This is a desperate, terrifying business. The first blows are exchanged with a dull thud of wood on wood as they strike each other's shields. The fight is clumsy, ugly, and brutal. The men are panting, their knuckles white on the handles of their clubs. The landscape itself is a source of wonder. For a peasant who may have never travelled more than 10 miles from their home village, the world unfolding before them is a constant source of novelty. They see great cities with towering cathedrals, cross wide rivers on stone bridges, and traverse forests that are said to be home to outlaws and fairies. Every day brings a new sight, a new experience that they will recount for the rest of their lives. It's the medieval equivalent of backpacking through Europe. Of course, the journey was also fraught with danger. Roads were poorly maintained and policed. Pilgrims were prime targets for robbers and con artists. Sickness was a constant threat, and many who set out on pilgrimage never returned, succumbing to disease or accident along the way. This element of risk, however, only added to the spiritual significance of the undertaking. To complete a pilgrimage was a genuine achievement, a testament to one's faith and endurance. Historians still argue about the primary motivation for most pilgrims. Was it genuine, heartfelt piety and a desire for spiritual salvation? Or was it a more complex mix of social pressure, a desire for adventure, and the hope of a good time away from the drudgery of daily life? Many pilgrimage sites were also associated with miraculous healing, and people would travel for weeks in the desperate hope of a cure for a sick child or a chronic ailment. The line between faith, hope, and recreation was incredibly blurry. A quirky and distinctly medieval aspect of pilgrimage was the obsession with relics and souvenirs. Upon reaching their destination, pilgrims would not only pray at the shrine, but also purchase a pilgrim badge. These were small, mass-produced trinkets made of cheap lead or pewter, depicting the symbol of the saint, a scallop shell for St. James, a Canterbury bell for St. Thomas. Pilgrims would sew these badges onto their hats or cloaks. They served as proof that you had completed the journey, a bit like a modern-day marathon medal or a passport stamp. They were also believed to hold a residual spiritual power from the shrine, acting as a protective amulet on the journey home. Finally, after weeks on the road, your group arrives at the shrine. The atmosphere inside the great church is a strange mix of solemnity and tourist trap hustle. You see believers weeping and praying fervently before the glittering jewel-encrusted reliquary that supposedly holds a fragment of a saint's bone. But you also see priests selling indulgences, vendors hawking souvenirs, and official guides loudly explaining the history of the site. It's a spiritual marketplace. After a short stay, the journey begins again, this time heading home. The mood is lighter now, the spiritual duty fulfilled. The stories on the road become more frequent, the laughter a little louder. The pilgrims have their badges, their stories, and their shared memories. They have been cleansed of their sins, perhaps, but they have also been entertained. They have participated in one of the most profound and multifaceted experiences the medieval world had to offer, a journey that was equal parts penance, party, and public performance. And sometimes, the idea of a final judgment was not left to the afterlife. but decided right here on Earth, in a very public and brutal way. This is not the trained violence of a soldier. It is the desperate struggle of ordinary men fighting for their lives and their reputations. Trial by combat was most famously used in cases of treason or serious criminal accusations, but it could also be used to settle property disputes. One of the more peculiar applications of this was in disputes between a town and a monastery over land rights. In such cases, since a monastery couldn't physically fight, each side would hire a champion, a professional fighter who would duel on their behalf. The outcome of the fight between these two hired thugs would legally determine who owned the contested meadow. As the fight wears on, the craftsman begins to tire. The stranger, who is larger and stronger, presses his advantage. He lands a heavy blow on the craftsman's shield, splintering the wood. Another blow catches the craftsman on the shoulder, and he stumbles to one knee with a cry of pain. The crowd gasps. Is this the hand of God at work? The church's relationship with the judicial duel was deeply conflicted. While the practice was rooted in a belief in divine intervention, many influential theologians and popes condemned it as a barbaric and superstitious practice that tempted God to perform a miracle on demand. They argued that guilt and innocence should be determined by rational inquiry and evidence, not by a fistfight. The famous Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 officially forbade clergy from participating in or blessing trials by combat, a major step that led to its gradual decline in favour of trial by jury. Historians still debate the true function of trial by combat. Was it a genuine, if flawed, attempt at justice in an age before modern forensic science? Or was it simply a way for the powerful to legitimise their use of violence, a system where the strongest man, not the most righteous, would almost always win? It was likely a bit of both, a system that felt just to the people of the time, even if it appears to us as a brutal and arbitrary gamble. A strange and documented fringe case of the judicial duel involved animals. In 1371 in France, a pig was put on trial for killing a child. After being found guilty by a human court, it was publicly executed. While this wasn't a trial by combat, the underlying belief was similar, that the animal, by committing a crime, had acted as an agent of evil, and was subject to the same legal and moral judgment as a human. Back in the fighting ring, the craftsman is down. The stranger stands over him, his club raised, demanding his surrender. The craftsman, dazed and bleeding, yields. It is over. The judgment has been rendered. The crowd begins to murmur, their tension releasing. They have witnessed a divine verdict. The guilty man will be led away to face his punishment, and the community's sense of order, violently disrupted by the initial crime, has been violently restored. This raw, public finality was a form of mass entertainment, a spectacle that was second only to the ultimate public performance of justice, the execution, and the cutting of the body into 4 pieces. The severed head and quarters would then be displayed publicly, often on the city gates, as a permanent rotting warning to others. Heretics or those convicted of witchcraft might be burned at the stake, a death that was seen as purifying and a way to destroy the evil both in body and soul. For the nobility who committed capital crimes, the privilege of beheading by sword or axe was sometimes granted, as it was considered a more honourable and less painful death than hanging. Historians still argue about the true effect of these brutal public spectacles. Did they actually deter crime by showcasing the terrifying power of the law? Or did they simply brutalise the populace, desensitising them to violence and creating a morbid, unhealthy fascination with death and suffering? The evidence is ambiguous. While the authorities certainly believed in the deterrent effect, the festive atmosphere and the sheer number of repeat attendees suggest that for many, it was simply a thrilling, dramatic show. A quirky, and rather grim, fringe belief associated with executions was the executioner's touch. It was a common superstition that the touch of a condemned man or a fragment from the gallows could have healing properties. People suffering from diseases like scrofula, a type of tuberculosis, or other ailments would sometimes pay the executioner to allow them to touch the corpse, hoping for a miraculous cure. It's a bizarre intersection of state-sanctioned violence and folk magic. The moment arrives. The condemned has finished their speech. The rope is placed around their neck. The cart is pulled away. The body drops, and the crowd lets out a collective gasp, a sound that is part horror, part relief, part thrill. The show is over. The body will be left hanging for some time as a continued warning. The crowd begins to disperse, chattering excitedly, dissecting the performance they have just witnessed. They will talk about it for days. It was a good death, or a bad one. The man was brave, or he was a coward. They have been entertained, and the social order has been violently, publicly, and unforgettably reaffirmed. The day's fun is over, and now, perhaps, it is time for a wash. After the grim spectacle of the gallows, the festive atmosphere of the crowd suddenly feels ghoulish and cloying. You feel a need to wash away not just the dust of the square, but the moral grime of the day's entertainment. A bath, you decide, is not a luxury but a necessity. You leave the main square and duck into a narrower side street, following the faint but unmistakable scent of wood smoke and damp heat, and the distant sound of echoing boisterous chatter. You are heading for the public bathhouse, or as it was commonly known in England, the stews. The grim field of the judicial duel fades, but the morbid public fascination with justice continues. You find yourself in the main square of a large town or city, pressed in by a massive, eager crowd. The atmosphere is strangely festive, almost like a market day. Vendors are selling pies and ale. People are chatting and laughing. But the focal point of all this attention is a stark wooden structure that has been erected in the centre of the square, a gallows or a scaffold. Today is a public execution day, and for the medieval populace this was a premier form of public entertainment. The event was a carefully managed piece of street theatre, with a clear narrative arc. The performance often began miles away. The condemned prisoner would be paraded through the streets from the jail to the place of execution. This procession was slow and deliberate, designed to be seen by as many people as possible. The prisoner, often tied to a cart, was the unwilling star of the show. The crowd would jeer, shout insults, and sometimes throw mud or rotten vegetables. It was a ritual of public shaming, a final stripping away of the person's dignity before their life was taken. As the procession reaches the scaffold, a hush falls over the crowd. A priest climbs the steps with the condemned, offering last rites and a chance for a final confession. This was a crucial part of the drama. The condemned was expected to give a gallows speech. This was their last chance to address the world. Some would confess their crimes, warn others against a life of sin, and ask for the crowd's prayers. This was the ideal, a moment of penitence that reaffirmed the justice of their sentence and the moral order of the community. Others, however, might use this platform to protest their innocence, curse the authorities, or even tell jokes, displaying a defiant bravery that could win the grudging respect of the crowd. The quality of a person's death, how they faced their end, was a matter of intense public interest and gossip. Did they die well, or did they weep and beg for mercy? The executioner himself was a paradoxical figure. He was both a vital public official and a social outcast. His job was to carry out the state's ultimate judgment, but the nature of his work, the shedding of blood, often meant he had to live on the fringes of the town and was shunned by his neighbours. A skilled executioner who could perform his task quickly and efficiently was a valuable commodity. A clumsy one who botched the job and caused prolonged suffering could incite a riot from the angry crowd. The methods of execution were varied and often tailored to the crime. Hanging was the most common method for common criminals like thieves. But for more serious crimes, the punishments were designed to be spectacularly brutal, a form of visceral communication from the state to its subjects. Traitors could be hanged, drawn, and quartered. A gruesome, multi-stage process that involved partial hanging, disembowelment while still alive, beheading, creating a large red circular mark. It was thought to draw out impurities. The idea of having a doctor's appointment that involved being bled in a noisy public bathhouse right next to someone enjoying a beer is a perfect example of the medieval world's very different approach to health, hygiene, and privacy. Finally, a tub frees up. You slip into the hot water. It's not chlorinated or filtered, and you try not to think too hard about the communal aspect of the water itself. The soap is a harsh, greasy block made from lye and animal fat. It smells faintly of wood smoke and does the job, but it's not a luxurious experience. Still, the heat soaks into your bones, easing the tension of the day. You're clean. But you're also more deeply enmeshed in the town's social fabric. After an hour in the stews, you'd know who was feuding with whom, who was having a good harvest, and whose daughter was about to be married. Every face tells a story, and you're about to see a competition where the face itself is the main event. You emerge from the steamy, boisterous world of the bathhouse, feeling cleaner but no less aware of the strange social currents of the town. Your path now leads you to the edge of the city, where a country fair is in full swing. This isn't a small village fete, but a large, chaotic and commercially vital event. Merchants have set up stalls selling everything from woolen cloth to exotic spices. Livestock is lowing and bleating in pens. Jugglers and acrobats perform for scattered crowds, and the air is a rich tapestry of roasting meat, sweet mead and dusty hay. You wander through the throng, past games of chance and skill. A man is offering a prize for anyone who can climb a greased pole. Another is taking bets on a cockfight, a smaller, more portable version of the bear baiting you witnessed earlier, but you're drawn towards a small makeshift stage where a particularly loud and jeering crowd has gathered. They are not watching a play or listening to a minstrel. They are howling with laughter at a series of contestants who are, one by one, doing something utterly bizarre. This is a gurning competition. The goal is simple: to pull the ugliest, most distorted, most grotesque face possible. The contestant who elicits the most laughter and disgusted groans from the audience wins a prize. A large, burly farmer with a magnificent beard steps onto the stage. He takes a deep breath, and then his face contorts. He pulls his lower lip up over his nose, crosses his eyes until they nearly touch, and puffs out his cheeks, transforming his normally stoic, respectable face into a monstrous comical mask. The crowd roars its approval. He holds the pose for a few seconds, his face turning red with the effort before letting it relax back to normal. You know you've arrived when you see the sign, a simple wooden carving of a bathtub, or sometimes just a fresh leafy branch hung over the door, a signal of the natural watery cleansing available within. You push open the door and are hit by a wall of warm, wet air, thick with steam. The noise from inside is a jumble of splashing water, loud conversations and the occasional burst of laughter, all amplified by the hard stone and wood surfaces. A burly man near the door, the keeper, takes your penny admission fee with a grunt, his role seemingly half receptionist, half bouncer. You step into the main bathing hall and any modern notion of a quiet private spa is instantly shattered. The room is a large, steamy, cavernous space filled with dozens of large wooden tubs, and they are occupied. The most striking thing is that it's a mixed affair. Men and women are bathing together, sometimes 2 or even 3 to a tub, chatting as casually as if they were at a market stall. The concept of nudity is far more relaxed and matter-of-fact than you might expect. This is the great tradition of communal bathing, a holdover from the Roman era, and it is, at its heart, a deeply social activity. This isn't just a place to get clean, it's a community centre. In one corner, 2 men sit in a tub with a wooden board balanced between them, deeply engrossed in a game of chess. A server, a young woman with her dress hitched up to her knees, wades through the shallow water on the floor carrying a tray of ale and small meat pies to the bathers. The food, you imagine, must get aggressively steamed by the time it reaches its destination, but no one seems to mind. This is a place for leisure, for gossip, for business deals, and for catching up on the local news. But the stews had a dual reputation. The very word stew would eventually become synonymous with brothel, and for good reason. While many bathhouses were respectable establishments, many others were indeed fronts for prostitution. The intimate, relaxed atmosphere could easily lend itself to less than innocent activities. The church regularly condemned the bathhouses as dens of sin and moral corruption, places that encouraged lewdness and licentiousness. Historians still argue whether the primary function of the average urban bathhouse was hygiene and socialising, or if they were, for the most part, simply tolerated red-light districts. You notice a man get out of his tub and walk over to a curtained-off alcove. Following him is another man carrying a bag of tools. This is the barber surgeon, a common figure at the bathhouse. His services went far beyond a simple shave and a haircut. He was here to offer minor medical procedures, and the most common one was bloodletting. The theory of the 4 humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, dominated medieval medicine. Illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these humours, and letting out a bit of excess blood was considered a standard way to restore balance and health. From a distance, you witness this quirky and slightly unnerving wellness treatment. The barber surgeon might use a lancet to make a small incision, or he might practice cupping. This involved placing a heated glass cup on the person's skin. As the air inside the cup cooled, It created a vacuum that sucked the skin up into the glass, drawing blood to the surface, and the competition is open to all, but it's a form of entertainment that belongs squarely to the common folk. There is nothing noble or refined about it. It's a celebration of the grotesque, a deliberate rejection of beauty and decorum. It's a moment where ugliness, not beauty, is rewarded. The prize is often something simple and rustic, a new smock, a side of bacon, or, most coveted of all, a horse collar decorated with bells and ribbons. This is where the competition often gets its name, gurning through a braffin. A braffin is an old word for a horse collar. In many traditional gurning contests, the contestant had to frame their distorted face within the rigid oval of a real horse collar, adding to both the challenge and the rustic absurdity of the spectacle. You can imagine the winner proudly taking his prize, a symbol of equine labour, and wearing it like a medal. You watch as another contestant, a wiry old man with very few teeth, takes his turn. His lack of teeth gives him a distinct advantage. He seems able to fold his entire face in on itself, his chin nearly touching his nose, creating a ghoulish visage that makes several people in the front row recoil in mock horror, which is of course the highest form of praise. This tradition is particularly associated with rural England, and incredibly, it still survives today. The Egremont Crab Fair in Cumbria, which received its royal charter in 1267, hosts the annual World Gurning Championship. It's a living link to this strange medieval pastime. The faces pulled by modern champions are every bit as grotesque and technically impressive as their medieval predecessors. Historians still argue about the deeper social meaning of gurning. Was it just a silly way to win a prize? Or was it, like the Feast of Fools or the Charivari, a form of carnivalesque expression? By deliberately making themselves ugly, the peasants were thumbing their noses at the aristocratic ideals of beauty and courtly grace. It was a celebration of the peasant body, with all its imperfections and its capacity for monstrous transformation. It was a way of saying, you may have your fine clothes and pretty faces, but we have this. A quirky fringe element of these country fairs often involved vegetable-based humour. Competitions were held for the most suggestive or human-like root vegetable. A farmer might proudly display a turnip that looked uncannily like the local priest, or a carrot with 2 legs. It's the same spirit as gurning, finding humour and humanity in the earthy, the misshapen and the grotesque. It's a folk art form that celebrates the happy accidents of nature. The final contestant of the day is a young woman, which is unusual. She steps onto the stage, and for a moment the crowd is quiet, unsure what to expect. Then, with a look of fierce concentration, she produces a face every bit as distorted and hilarious as the men who came before her. The crowd, after a moment of stunned silence, erupts in the loudest cheer of the day. She is declared the winner. She's handed the prize, a large wheel of cheese, which she holds aloft like a trophy. The competition is over. The faces of the contestants return to normal. They are once again just farmers, labourers and villagers. But for a few brief, glorious moments, they were masters of the monstrous, champions of the grotesque. They have proven that fun can be found not just in skill or piety, but in the simple, joyful act of making an exceptionally ugly face. It's a competition of pure expression, a stark contrast to the silent, intellectual warfare you're about to witness. You turn from the raucous, visceral laughter of the gurning competition and seek refuge in a quieter, more cerebral world. The boisterous energy of the country fair melts away, and you find yourself in the solar of a castle, a private, comfortable room where the lord and his family could retreat from the public life of the great hall. The room is warmed by its own fireplace and lit by a large glass window, a sign of considerable wealth. Here 2 figures are hunched over a small square table, their minds locked in silent, intense combat. They are playing chess. The board is not the simple plastic or wood you might know, but a work of art in itself, perhaps made of inlaid wood or carved ivory. The pieces are not the abstract Staunton design that is standard today. They are small, intricate sculptures. The king is a tiny, enthroned monarch, the queen, his robed consort, the knights are miniature mounted warriors, and the rooks are not castles, but chariots, or, in some designs, frenzied warriors known as wardens. The most famous surviving examples of these pieces are the Lewis chessmen, a stunning hoard of 12th century figures carved from walrus ivory, their faces expressive with shock, contemplation, or grim determination. The two players are a nobleman, his brow furrowed in concentration, and a visiting bishop, his long, pale fingers resting thoughtfully on his chin. There is no cheering crowd, no prize of bacon or cheese. The only sounds are the soft click of an ivory piece being placed on a new square and the crackle of the fire. Yet the tension in the room is as thick as it was on the jousting field. This is not just a game, it is a microcosm of the medieval world, a war game that simulates strategy, social hierarchy, and the ever-present threat of political manoeuvring. Chess arrived in Europe from the Persian Empire via the Arab world around the 10th century. It was quickly adopted by the aristocracy and the senior clergy, the two classes with the leisure time to master its complexities. It was seen as the ultimate thinking man's game, a perfect training ground for the mind of a ruler or a general. A book on statecraft from the 13th century advised young princes to play chess to learn how to govern, how to anticipate their enemies' moves, and how to sacrifice a lesser piece for the greater good. You watch as the bishop, with a faint, almost imperceptible smile, slides his queen across the board. The move is elegant and deadly. The nobleman's king is suddenly trapped, caught in a pincer movement between the queen and a knight. It's checkmate. The game is over. The nobleman sighs, a sound of frustration and respect. He has been outmanoeuvred. He nods to the bishop, acknowledging his defeat. The game they were playing was slightly different from modern chess. The queen, or Fürstöz, was a much weaker piece, able to move only one square diagonally. The bishop, or alfil, from the Arabic for elephant, could only move two squares diagonally, and could jump over other pieces. This made the game much slower, a war of attrition rather than the swift tactical strikes of the modern game. The dramatic increase in the queen's power, which transformed her into the most formidable piece on the board, happened at the end of the 15th century, a change that some historians cheekily link to the rise of powerful female monarchs, like Isabella I of Castile. The game was also a subject of moral debate. While it was praised for its intellectual virtues, some hardline religious figures condemned it as a pointless and addictive distraction from prayer and religious duties. It was a form of idleness, and idleness was the devil's workshop. There are tales of saints who, in their worldly youth, were obsessed with chess, and later renounced it as a vanity. Historians still argue whether chess was seen primarily as a respectable intellectual pursuit, or a slightly suspect, time-wasting obsession, a high-class form of gambling with time instead of money. A quirky and popular variant of the game was problem chess, which you might recognise as the chess puzzles in a modern newspaper. A player would be presented with a prearranged board and challenged to find the checkmate in a specific number of moves. Noble patrons would hire chess masters to compose these problems for their entertainment and to stump their rivals. It was a way to display one's intellectual prowess without having to sit through a full, slow game. The nobleman and the bishop reset the pieces. The silent battle is about to begin again. The game they play is a reflection of their world. Each piece has its place in the social order, its own prescribed way of moving. The humble pawns march forward, sacrificing themselves for the powerful pieces behind them. The knights leap over obstacles in their path, and the king, the heart of the kingdom, is both the most important and the most vulnerable piece on the board. The game is a lesson in power, patience, and the cold, hard logic of sacrifice. It's the perfect pastime for a class of people whose real lives were a constant high-stakes game of strategy, a game that was often played out not on a board, but on the hunting fields. The quiet, intellectual intensity of the chess game dissolves, but the sense of aristocratic leisure remains. You find yourself once again on horseback, but this is a different kind of outing from the focused, elegant hunt of the falconer. You are part of a much larger, more boisterous and sprawling event, a noble hunting party. The crisp morning air is filled with the baying of hounds, the calls of hunting horns, and the excited chatter of dozens of participants. This is not just about finding food for the table, it is one of the most important social and political activities of the noble class. A grand hunt was a way for a king or a powerful lord to display his wealth, his authority, and his generosity. He would invite his key vassals, neighbouring lords, and important allies to join him. It was a combination of a summit meeting, a team-building exercise, and a massive mobile party. The procession moving into the lord's private forest, or chase, is a spectacle in itself. There are the nobles on their fine horses, the ladies of the court riding alongside them, often in special, more comfortable saddles, and a whole army of specialised servants. There are the kennel masters in charge of the hounds, the grooms for the horses, and the burners, who are responsible for feeding the dogs. Most important are the huntsmen, expert trackers who know the forest intimately and can read the signs of the prey. The prey itself is significant. The most prestigious animals to hunt were the red deer stag and the wild boar. These were large, powerful and dangerous creatures, and hunting them was a test of courage and skill. The strict forest laws, which we now see as a tool of oppression, were designed to protect these noble beasts for the exclusive enjoyment of the aristocracy. A peasant caught poaching a deer from the lord's forest could be fined, mutilated, or even executed. The deer were, in a very real sense, more valuable than the people who lived on the same land. You follow the party deep into the ancient woods. The huntsmen and their tracking dogs have been out since dawn, trying to locate a worthy stag. The sound of a horn echoes through the trees, a specific sequence of notes that communicates a message to the rest of the party. A large stag has been found. The hunt is on. The chase is a wild, exhilarating and chaotic affair. The party gallops through the forest, leaping over fallen logs, ducking under low-hanging branches, all following the sound of the hounds. The dogs, bred for stamina and scenting ability, stream ahead. They're baying a constant thrilling soundtrack to the pursuit. It's a test of horsemanship and nerve. A fall could mean a broken bone or worse. After a long chase that might last for hours and cover many miles, the stag, exhausted, is finally brought to bay. It turns to face the dogs, its antlers lowered, making its last stand. This is a crucial, ritualized moment. The dogs hold the stag at bay, but it is the privilege of the highest-ranking nobleman present to deliver the killing blow. He dismounts, approaches the cornered animal, and kills it with a swift, skillful thrust of a spear or a hunting sword. The hunt is over, but the ritual is not. The unmaking of the deer is the next step. This is the careful, ceremonial butchering of the animal, performed by the chief huntsman. It's a complex procedure, with specific cuts reserved for different purposes. The best cuts of venison would go to the lord's table. Other parts would be given to the hounds as a reward. This was known as the quarry. Portions might also be distributed to the other participants in the hunt, or even to the local poor as a gesture of the lord's largesse. Nothing was wasted. A quirky and particularly telling part of this ritual was the maw, the single, long, mournful note blown on the horn to signal the death of the stag. This was followed by the pray, a triumphant blast to celebrate the successful hunt. The complex language of horn calls was a vital skill for any nobleman. It was a secret code that separated the true sportsman from the amateur. Historians still argue about the primary function of the noble hunt. Was it essential military training, as its defenders claimed, keeping men and horses fit for cavalry warfare? Or was it, like so many other aristocratic pastimes, fundamentally about status and social bonding? By hunting together, the nobles reinforced their shared identity as a ruling warrior class, a group set apart from the rest of society by their right to ride, to hunt, and to kill. As the sun sets, the hunting party returns to the castle, tired, muddy, but triumphant. The stag is carried in a place of honour. That night, the great hall will be the scene of a magnificent feast, with the freshly killed venison as the centrepiece. There will be wine, music, and endless retellings of the day's adventure. Deals will be struck, alliances will be forged, and the bonds of power will be strengthened, all under the guise of a day's sport. The hunt was the work of the ruling class, disguised as play, and as the feast winds down and the castle prepares for sleep, you take one final walk, reflecting on the strange world of medieval fun. The echoes of the feast in the great hall, the laughter, the boastful stories of the hunt, the minstrel's song, begin to fade as you step out into the cold air of the castle courtyard. The night is vast and silent. Above you, the skies are deep, star-strewn velvet, an overwhelming canopy of light undimmed by the glow of a single city. The only sounds are the distant stamp of a horse in the stables, the crunch of your own feet on the gravel, and the lonely call of a watchman from the battlements. You pull your cloak tighter and begin a final walk, a quiet moment to process the strange journey you've been on. Your mind drifts back to the very beginning, to that smoky tavern. It seems a lifetime ago. From that simple starting point, You've witnessed the entire spectrum of what the medieval world considered fun. You saw the high and the low, the sacred and the profane, often tangled together so tightly they were impossible to separate. You watched knights in gleaming armour risk their lives for a lady's favour in the joust, a spectacle of choreographed violence, and then you saw entire villages descend into anarchic, muddy chaos for the sake of a pig's bladder in a game of mob football. It seems the number one rule of medieval fun is that there's a pretty good chance someone ends up bleeding. You think of the strange cruelty that was packaged as entertainment, the grim, bloody pit of the bear baiting, the surreal, giggling sadism of fox tossing. You try to understand the mindset that saw an animal suffering not as a tragedy, but as a hilarious diversion, a sport. It speaks to a world where the line between life and death was thin and familiar, where suffering was a public spectacle, and where the hierarchy of creation, with man at the top and animals far below, was an undisputed fact of life, as solid as the stone walls around you now. But it wasn't all blood and guts. You remember the strange masked mummers, their ancient play of death and rebirth, a thread connecting them to a past even they didn't fully understand, binding their community together in the dead of winter. You recall the grand, epic scale of the mystery plays, where an entire city's faith and pride rumble through the streets on pageant wagons, and you remember the gurning, that glorious, unashamed celebration of the grotesque. You have to admit, winning a whole wheel of cheese just for looking like a melted gargoyle is a pretty good deal. It strikes you now, walking under the silent gaze of the stars, that almost none of this was leisure in the way you understand it. For most people in this era, there wasn't a neat division between work time and free time. Life was a relentless cycle of labour, dictated by the sun and the seasons. Fun wasn't something you did after work. It was woven into the very fabric of life's obligations. The archery at the butts was a legal requirement for national defence, but also a beloved village competition. The pilgrimage was a profound act of religious piety, but it was also the only vacation most people would ever get. The noble hunt was a display of power and a political tool, but it was also a thrilling, adrenaline-fueled party. You place a hand on the cold, rough stone of the castle wall and look out over the darkened landscape. The night itself was a source of fear for these people. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence, a dangerous realm filled with thieves, wild animals, and, in the popular imagination, demons and malevolent spirits. The night air, or miasma, was thought to carry disease. Your quiet, contemplative stroll would have been seen by many as a reckless, even foolish act. And that, perhaps, is the key to it all. Their lives were so often governed by forces beyond their control, by plague, by famine, by the whims of their lords, by a god whose judgment was both feared and sought. Historians still argue whether these varied, often violent pastimes were primarily a safety valve, to release social tension and aggression in a controlled way, or a deliberate tool of the ruling classes to reinforce the social hierarchy and keep the populace distracted. Looking back on the Feast of Fools and the savage justice of the Charivari, it feels like both were true at once. They were moments when the world was turned upside down, precisely so it could be set right again. They were playing with the very rules that governed their existence.